Hello again, my friend. I am glad you found your way back to this quiet little corner tonight. Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull a blanket over your shoulders if you have one nearby, because where we are headed tonight is somewhere cold, somewhere stone-walled and salty-aired, somewhere that has been quietly keeping a secret for well over 1,000 years. In the year 1539, a king gave an order that erased almost every monastery in England. Roofs were stripped bare. Walls were pulled apart stone by stone. Entire communities of monks and nuns were scattered within months, and the gardens they had tended for generations were left to rot in the salty air. And yet something green kept growing there anyway. Nobody watered it. Nobody asked it to survive. But 500 years later, it is still there. Tonight I want to tell you about the vegetable that refused to disappear. Before we step into the story together, let me ask you for one small thing. If this quiet place has ever brought you comfort before, think about following along so you never lose your way back here. A simple like helps far more than you would guess, and if you leave a comment, I promise you I read every single one. Tell me where you're joining me from tonight and what time it is where you live right now. I love imagining all of you scattered across so many different clocks and calendars settling in for the very same story at once. Now go ahead and turn the lights down as low as you can stand. If you happen to have a fan nearby, switch it on for that soft, steady hum in the background. Get yourself wrapped up, and let's walk together into a garden that somehow managed to outlast a king. Tonight you will meet the sisters who kept this small garden alive with nothing but faith and frost-bitten hands, the ruler who tried to erase every trace of them, and the one stubborn sea-scented plant that outlived them all. So settle in, get warm, and let's begin gently, the way all good stories about small things probably should. Picture, if you will, a stretch of coastline somewhere in the north of England nearly 1,000 years ago. The sea is grey and endless. The air tastes faintly of salt, and behind a low stone wall in a garden barely bigger than a modern backyard, a young nun kneels in the dirt with soil pressed under her fingernails. History never bothered to record her name. It rarely did for women like her. But she is there every single morning, rain or shine, tending neat rows of a tall, glossy-leafed plant topped with clusters of small yellow-green flowers that smell oddly enough faintly of myrrh. Somewhere behind her a bell rings out across the mist, calling the rest of the community to morning prayer. Gulls cry somewhere out over the grey water. She does not look up right away. There is dirt to finish turning before the light gets any better, and this particular plant does not care whether she's tired or cold or half asleep on her feet. The old Romans had a name for this plant, Olus atrum, which simply meant the dark vegetable, a nod to its small black seeds. Over the centuries the name softened into something you might actually recognize today, Alexander's. Roman soldiers carried its seeds with them across their entire empire, and when the Romans finally packed up and left Britain behind, the plant somehow stayed. It settled quietly into monastery gardens all along the coast, almost as if it had decided this cold, damp island was home now. Funny enough, a lot of people today assume the name Alexander's must trace back to Alexander the Great Conqueror of half the known world. It makes for a nice story. But most historians actually trace it back to that plain old Latin phrase Olus atrum, which over centuries of sloppy pronunciation and even sloppier spelling slowly morphed into the fancier-sounding name we use now. Sometimes history is romantic, and sometimes it is just a really long game of telephone. Monks and nuns were some of the only people left in Europe who still copied out old Roman farming texts by candlelight, page after careful page, keeping alive gardening knowledge that might otherwise have vanished completely. And Alexander's was exactly the kind of plant those old texts praised. For a nun tending a garden like this one, it was not simply something pretty to look at. It was survival. Its thick stalks could be simmered into soup. Its leaves worked beautifully as a sharp, peppery herb. Its roots roasted, slowly tasted a little like parsnip. In the harshest weeks of late winter, when almost nothing else in the garden had woken up yet, Alexander's was very often the first brave green thing willing to show its face. Sailors chewed on it during long voyages to fight off scurvy. Monks and nuns turned to it as a gentle remedy for an upset stomach, and because it tolerated salty sea air better than almost anything else they tried to grow, it thrived in gardens perched right at the edge of the coast where softer, gentler plants simply gave up. You can almost picture her hands red and cracked from the cold, working through the dirt to loosen a thick, pale root. She would rinse it in a bucket of icy water pulled up from the well, then carry the whole bundle inside stems and all to whoever was cooking that day. There was no waste in a place like this. Every leaf, every stalk, every root eventually found its way into a simmering pot, filling the whole kitchen with a smell somewhere between celery and something a little sweeter, a little stranger. So year after year, generation after generation, the sisters planted it. They harvested it. They passed down little tricks for cooking it to each new novice who arrived the same easy way your own grandmother might once have handed down a recipe that nobody ever bothered writing on paper because everyone in the family simply knew it by heart. Even poorer families outside the monastery walls leaned on this plant. In Ireland, for example, families who could not afford much of anything made a simple warming pottage out of Alexander's mixed with nettles and watercress, a humble little bowl of soup that kept entire households fed through the hungriest stretches of the year. For nearly 500 years, this quiet rhythm continued almost invisible to the wider world. Kings rose, kings fell. Wars came and went along roads not far from that little garden, and through all of it the very same green plant kept returning every single spring faithful as ever in that same small patch of earth by the sea. Popes changed, borders shifted. None of it mattered much to a plant with its roots this deep. Then in the year 1539 everything changed. A king named Henry VIII, buried in debt and locked in a bitter quarrel with the church in Rome, made a decision that would reshape the entire country. He ordered the closing of nearly every monastery in England, well over 800 of them in total. Historians today simply call it the dissolution of the monasteries, a phrase that sounds almost gentle when you say it slowly like that. But the reality on the ground was anything but gentle. Roofs were stripped bare. Walls were pulled apart for stone that could be sold or hauled away and reused elsewhere. Sacred objects were melted down for their value, and the people who had made their home inside those walls, the monks, the nuns, the quiet gardeners among them, were sent away with almost nothing to their name. Picture the day the king's men finally arrived at a garden much like this one. Boots crossed ground that had only ever felt bare feet and soft-soled sandals before. An order was spoken aloud announcing that the community was dissolved effective immediately. The sisters were given hours, not days, to gather what little they were allowed to keep. And somewhere behind them, completely ignored in all the commotion, stood row after row of a plant nobody in that chaotic moment had any time left to think about. Can you imagine it? Spending your entire life caring for the very same patch of earth, learning every single one of its moods, and then one morning being told to simply walk away and never return. Most of what those communities had spent centuries building did not survive what came next. The buildings crumbled down into the kind of dramatic hollow stone skeletons you can still find scattered across the English countryside today, the sort that tourists now photograph at sunset without ever knowing the full story hiding behind them. The people scattered too, forced to rebuild entire lives out of almost nothing in a world that suddenly had no use left for what they used to be. But here is the part that honestly still gives me a small shiver every time I think about it. Nobody ever came back to tend that vegetable garden. Nobody watered it. Nobody pulled a single weed from it through the cold months the way the sisters once faithfully had. And yet Alexander's did not disappear. It had already scattered its own seeds into every crack of every stone wall nearby, into every patch of loose, disturbed soil around the ruins. So it simply kept growing, completely on its own, without a single soul left to ask it to. And it is still doing exactly that today. If you walk certain stretches of the English coastline right now, near the ruins of old abbeys and crumbling castle walls, you can still find Alexanders growing wild, tall and glossy, and faintly myrrh-scented in almost the very same spots where nuns and monks once planted it by hand 5 centuries ago. Nobody replanted it. Nobody has tended it for 500 years straight. It simply never packed up and left. There is something almost funny about that if you sit with it long enough. Henry VIII managed to pull down roofs, melt down treasures, and scatter entire religious communities across the whole of England. And somehow, quietly one modest patch of vegetables in a forgotten corner of a ruined garden just kept right on doing exactly what it had always done. Nobody ever told it that its keepers were gone, so it never got the message to stop. Of course, this story does not end with some grand, triumphant comeback. Alexander's never returned to rule our modern kitchens the way it once ruled monastery gardens. As the years rolled on, and English cooking slowly shifted, a different vegetable began showing up on dinner tables instead. Celery, milder, paler, and far easier to grow in tidy, predictable rows. By the 1700s, most people had simply moved along the same quiet way. We stop opening an old app once a shinier one comes along. Alexander's was not defeated. It was not destroyed. It was just gently, slowly forgotten by the very people who centuries earlier could not have survived a single winter without it. And maybe that is the real quiet lesson tucked inside this whole story. The things that last the longest in this world are not always the ones remembered the loudest. Sometimes they are the quiet ones, the ones still rooted somewhere, still pushing their way up through the cracks long after everyone who once cared for them has scattered off into their own separate lives or simply moved along to something new and shinier. That young nun whose name we will never know could not have imagined kneeling there in the cold dirt with soil under her fingernails, that the small green thing she was planting would still be standing 500 years after the very walls around her had fallen down completely. Think about that for a moment if you like. Think about the quiet things in your own life that have somehow outlasted storms you were once certain would wipe them out completely. A friendship you thought you would lose, a habit you thought you would drop, a small piece of who you are that refused to fade no matter how much changed around it. Maybe survival does not always look dramatic. Maybe most of the time it looks exactly like this. Something small still quietly growing long after everyone stopped expecting it to. But survival stories do not all look the same. Some, like this one, happen quietly unnoticed in a forgotten corner by the sea. Others happen right in the middle of the spotlight at the tables of the most powerful people alive. If a humble, salt-loving vegetable like this one could quietly outlast a king and his entire kingdom, just wait until you hear about the vegetable that came centuries before it. One so prized, so sweetly delicious, that an entire empire was once ordered to hand it over as a yearly tribute. Its story does not begin in a peaceful garden by the sea. It begins at the dinner table of one of the most powerful and most feared men who ever lived. Let's step through that door together right into the heart of Rome itself. Picture a private dining room walls painted with hunting scenes and vines curling toward the ceiling, oil lamps throwing soft light across polished marble floors. Guests recline on couches instead of sitting upright, a servant moving quietly between them with a tray of food gathered from every corner of a sprawling empire. Venison brought down from the forests of Gaul, oysters packed in ice, and rushed north from the coast, wine so old it had outlived the very men who first pressed the grapes. And yet tucked somewhere among all that extravagance sat a small unassuming root vegetable that this particular emperor could not seem to get enough of. His name was Tiberius, and he ruled Rome for over 20 years, inheriting the empire from his adoptive father, a man history tends to remember rather more fondly, Augustus, where Augustus is often painted as calm, calculating, almost fatherly in the old Roman accounts. Tiberius comes across very differently. The historians who wrote about him, working sometimes decades after his death, described a man who grew steadily more withdrawn, as the years passed, more suspicious of the people closest to him, less interested in the noise and performance of ruling from the capital. Eventually he left Rome altogether and spent his final years on the island of Capri, governing an empire from a careful, almost paranoid distance. He was not by most accounts an easy man to please or an easy man to know, but there was one thing, oddly enough, that always seemed to please him, a humble root called Caesar, known to us today as skirret. According to the Roman writer Pliny, the elder Tiberius loved this root so much that he had it brought in as a form of yearly tribute from the Rhine, a stretch of territory along what is now the border between Germany and France. Think about that for a moment. An emperor who commanded legions across 3 continents, who could summon almost any delicacy the ancient world had to offer, set aside a formal standing order for a vegetable. Tribute in the Roman world usually meant grain, gold, or soldiers, the kind of resources an empire actually needed to keep functioning at scale. A ruler asking an entire region to hand over baskets of a single root vegetable year after year was unusual enough that Roman writers thought it worth recording at all. It tells you something about a man supposedly obsessed with control choosing to exercise a little of that same control over something as small and personal as his own dinner plate. Now here is where the story gets a little more interesting and a little more honest with you. Some modern historians actually question whether Pliny was describing skirret at all. Skirret, as it turns out, does not naturally grow anywhere near the Rhine region, which makes that particular detail a bit suspicious if you look closely. A few scholars believe Pliny may have mixed it up with something else entirely, most likely a parsnip, since ancient writers were not always careful about separating similar-looking roots into neat little categories the way modern botanists do. I find that little mix-up almost charming, if I am being honest with you. Even 2,000 years ago, somebody was getting their vegetables confused, and that small mix-up stuck around long enough to end up in the history books we still study today. It is a nice reminder that history, even the parts we treat as settled fact, is often a little messier than it first appears. Either way, the root itself deserves its moment in this story, mix-up or not. Skirret is not native to the Mediterranean at all. Most historians trace its roots quite literally all the way back to Eastern Asia, likely China, long before it ever reached a Roman table. Pliny the Elder, the very same writer who recorded Tiberius's fondness for this root, spent much of his life cataloguing the natural world in almost obsessive detail, filling volume after volume with descriptions of plants, animals and minerals from every province Rome touched. Skirret earns only a passing mention in all of that work, a few lines buried among thousands of pages. And yet it is often the smallest, most passing mentions in old texts like his that end up telling us the most about what ordinary daily life actually looked like long after the wars and the politics have faded from memory. By the time it shows up in Roman writing, skirret had already travelled thousands of miles, passed from hand to hand, garden to garden, for who knows how many generations before anyone bothered to write its name down. When it finally settled into European soil, it kept a whole cluster of small, sweet white roots, gathered together beneath one single plant, almost like a tiny bundle of pale fingers reaching down into the dirt. And when Roman legions eventually crossed the Channel and pushed into Britain, Skirt travelled with them, too likely following the very same military roads and supply routes that once carried a certain sea-loving plant we spent our last story with. Roman villas scattered across the British countryside kept their own kitchen gardens, and Skirt settled into that soil just as comfortably as it had settled into soil everywhere else it had ever travelled. That sweetness earned it quite a reputation. In German it became known as Zuckerwurzel, in Dutch Suikerwurtel, in Danish Sukkerrod. Every single one of those names means exactly the same thing, sugar root. Long before refined sugar was common or affordable in European kitchens, this quiet little vegetable was one of the sweetest things a garden could offer, and people across an entire continent apparently agreed on that, even without sharing a common language to describe it. Here is a small question worth sitting with for a second. How many vegetables today could earn the exact same nickname independently? In 3 or 4 different languages, I cannot think of many honestly. Can you? Skirret's popularity did not fade with the fall of Rome. If anything, it settled in for the long haul, quietly working its way through the centuries, largely unbothered by the empires rising and collapsing around it. In the 12th century, a Benedictine abbess named Hildegard von Bingen, a woman whose writing on herbs and healing still gets studied by historians today, included Skirt in her medical notes. She recommended crushing the root, mixing it with a little oil, and rubbing the mixture onto skin that had become cracked or split, particularly before sleep, as a gentle way to help it heal overnight. Whether or not that actually worked in any scientific sense, it tells you something important about how people saw this plant. They were not just eating it, they trusted it enough to put it on their own faces. And it is worth pausing here for a moment because Skirt was not simply pleasant to eat. It was practical in a way few root vegetables managed to match. Unlike many of its relatives, it is a perennial, meaning a single planting could keep producing for years without needing to be sown again. It shrugged off frost that would ruin more delicate crops, resisted most common garden pests, and tolerated poor soil far better than its reputation as a delicacy might suggest. On paper, it should have been the perfect vegetable for almost any household, rich or poor, north or south. And for a very long stretch of history it was exactly that. By the time we reached Tudor England centuries later, Skirt had firmly planted itself as a favourite on tables far grander than any ordinary household kitchen. And here is a small detail I find almost too fitting not to share with you. The very same king who in our last story ordered the destruction of monastery gardens across England, Henry VIII himself, was known to enjoy Skirt dishes at his own royal table. The same ruler who dismantled one entire chapter of vegetable history with a single decree was at that very same time quietly presiding over a golden age for a completely different one. History does love its little ironies, does it not? Tudor cooks treated Skirt as something worth real effort. One surviving recipe calls for the roots to be blanched and sliced, then layered with nutmeg, cinnamon, sugar dates, and even the marrow scraped from roasted bones, all rolled in egg yolk, baked slowly, and finished with a rich sauce made from white wine and a splash of tart verjuice. This was not peasant food. This was the kind of dish meant to impress an entire table of guests. Even a century later, an English gardener named John Warledge sat down to write an entire book about gardening, and could not resist pausing in the middle of all that practical advice to declare that few roots any garden could grow tasted quite so sweet or so pleasant. Around that same period, a well-known herbalist named Nicholas Culpeper listed Skirt in his own writing on plants and medicine, describing it in his own words as both pleasant to eat and truly good for the body. Another writer from that era described something he simply called Skirt milk. the roots mashed together with cream, baked with eggs and warm spices, until the whole dish turned soft and fragrant, the sort of thing you might imagine steaming gently on a cold winter evening, filling an entire kitchen with warmth. It was not only royal kitchens that valued this root either. Ordinary families with nothing more than a small plot behind their home found it just as useful, since a single planting left alone would quietly keep producing meal after meal for years, without much effort at all. For a household counting every scrap of food through a long winter, a vegetable that basically took care of itself was not a luxury. It was something more like a small, quiet form of security. Can you picture that kitchen for a moment? Firelight flickering across stone walls, the smell of nutmeg and warm cream drifting through the room, someone carefully spooning a pale golden mixture into a dish meant for people who could afford to eat well. It sounds almost cozy, does it not, for a food that has all but vanished from our modern tables? So what happened? If skirret was sweet enough to earn nicknames across half of Europe, sturdy enough to survive frost and disease better than most root vegetables, and beloved enough to end up on the tables of emperors and kings alike, why does almost nobody grow it today? The honest answer has less to do with taste and a great deal more to do with practicality. A food historian at one of England's royal palaces, who has spent years studying exactly this kind of forgotten crop, put it about as plainly as anyone could. Skirret, she explained, never had what it takes to become a commercial crop in the modern sense. Each plant produces only a small cluster of thin, slightly fiddly roots, nothing near the heavy uniform harvest a farmer could pull from a single potato plant. Pull one skirret plant from the ground, and a worker still has to sort through a tangle of thin, uneven roots by hand, some barely worth keeping at all. Pull one potato plant instead, and you get a handful of evenly sized tubers ready almost immediately for market. When you're feeding a growing city instead of a single royal table, that difference starts to matter enormously. And once cheap refined sugar became widely available across Europe, skirret quietly lost its other great advantage too, since nobody needed a vegetable to satisfy a sweet tooth anymore. There is a common misunderstanding worth clearing up here, by the way. It is tempting to assume skirret disappeared because it tasted bad, or because it turned out to be somehow unhealthy, the way certain foods fall out of favour today over health concerns. That simply is not true. Skirret was never rejected. It was outcompeted quietly and gradually by crops that were cheaper to grow at scale and easier to sell in bulk. Flavour had almost nothing to do with its decline. In other words, skirret was not defeated by a bad harvest or a plague or a king's decree. It was simply outcompeted slowly and quietly by crops that were easier to grow in bulk and cheaper to sell at market. Nobody made a dramatic announcement about it. There was no single event you could point to and say this is the day skirret lost. It just faded harvest by harvest, garden by garden, until almost nobody remembered planting it in the first place. Think of it a little like a favourite song from years ago. Nobody announces the day a song stops getting played on the radio. It simply gets replaced week after week by something newer, until one afternoon you realise you've not heard it in years, and you cannot quite remember when exactly that happened. You can every once in a while still find skirret today tucked into the corner of a specialty seed catalogue, or growing quietly in the garden of someone who collects old unusual crops on purpose. But it never quite reclaimed the place it once held. It remains even now mostly a footnote, a name most people encounter for the very first time in a story just like this one. I find something quietly humbling in that. We tend to imagine history as a string of battles and decrees and dramatic turning points, kings signing papers, armies crossing rivers. But sometimes the biggest losses happen without anyone making a decision at all. Nobody voted skirret off the table. People just stopped choosing it one small decision at a time until one day an emperor's favourite root had quietly slipped out of nearly every kitchen in the Western world. It makes me wonder about the small ordinary things in our own lives that might be fading the exact same way right now without any of us noticing. What is something you loved as a child that you have not thought about in years? A dish your grandmother used to make on certain afternoons? A small habit or tradition that simply stopped happening one year without anyone ever deciding it should? I would really love to hear about it in the comments below if you feel like sharing. Rome eventually fell, of course, the way every empire eventually does. But long before that final collapse, a new kind of power was already taking shape farther north, among people the Romans had once dismissed as barbarians. And centuries later, one of their descendants would attempt something no emperor, no matter how powerful, had ever quite managed. He would not simply request his favourite vegetable as a private personal tribute. He would write down an entire list and order every single garden across his empire to grow it, whether anyone particularly liked it or not. That he was not a Roman emperor, and he was not some distant pharaoh either. He was a Frankish king, a man who, by the time our story catches up with him, had already spent decades on horseback conquering, negotiating, and slowly stitching together the largest kingdom Europe had seen since Rome itself came apart at the seams centuries earlier. History remembers him as Charlemagne, which simply means Charles the Great, and by the year 800 his territory stretched across what is now France, most of Germany, and a good portion of Italy besides. On Christmas Day of that same year, standing in a church in Rome, he was crowned emperor by the Pope himself, the first person to hold that particular title in the West in well over 300 years. Historians still argue about how much Charlemagne actually knew in advance about that coronation, whether it was his idea or the Pope's. But either way, by the start of the 9th century, one man effectively controlled more of Europe than anyone had in centuries. Contemporary accounts describe him as an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a booming voice, and a surprisingly cheerful, curious temperament for someone who spent so much of his life at war. He loved books, even though he reportedly struggled with writing well himself, no matter how many tutors he brought to court to teach him. He kept scholars nearby, founded schools, and pushed for a wider revival of learning across his territories, a period historians now often call the Carolingian Renaissance. Ruling an empire this size in an age with no telephones, no postal service in any modern sense, and roads that could take weeks to travel safely, was an entirely different kind of challenge than anything a modern leader faces. A single written order copied by hand and carried on horseback to estates, scattered across thousands of miles, was often the only tool a king like this had to make sure his wishes were actually carried out. Can you imagine trying to run something this complicated with nothing faster than a horse to carry your instructions? Now, most rulers with that kind of power spend their energy on armies. Borders, taxes, the usual business of running an empire. Charlemagne certainly did all of that too. But somewhere in the middle of governing this enormous sprawling territory, he also found time to write something almost nobody expects from a medieval conqueror: detailed instructions about exactly which vegetables his estates were required to grow. The document survives today under the name Capitulare de Villis, which translates roughly and rather dryly to something like a chapter concerning the royal estates. Think of it as an internal operations manual for running the king's many farms and manors scattered across the empire, covering everything from how many blacksmiths each estate should employ, to how oxen should be recorded, to what happened to unclaimed pigs. Buried inside all of that practical bureaucracy sits one particular chapter that garden historians still study closely today, because it does something almost nobody had attempted in writing before it lists plant by plant exactly what Charlemagne wanted growing in every single garden under his authority. Let that sink in for a moment. This was not gentle advice. It was not a suggestion tucked into a letter. It was a formal royal order, the medieval equivalent of a legal mandate telling estate managers across an empire the size of Western Europe precisely which vegetables belonged in the ground. And the list itself is a little overwhelming in the best possible way. Leeks, onions, garlic, cabbages, parsnips. Carrots, which worth mentioning, were purple back then, more similar in colour and sweetness to a modern parsnip than to the bright orange vegetable sitting in your refrigerator right now. Peas, broad beans, chickpeas, radishes, celery, fennel, coriander. Lettuce so small and bitter it barely resembles the crisp, mild leaves we buy today. And vegetables were only part of it. The very same document goes on to specify fruit trees for the orchards too, named varieties of apple pear, plum quince, medlar, chestnut, fig and mulberry, along with detailed instructions on how many kinds of each an estate should plant to cover early, late, sweet and long-keeping harvests across the whole year. As if that were not thorough enough, Charlemagne also listed the birds he expected kept purely for decoration around his estates. Peacocks, swans, pheasants and turtle doves among them kept, as the old text puts it, for the sake of ornament. Somewhere between farm inventory and small private zoo, this document manages to be both at once. I like to imagine some exhausted royal steward halfway through writing all of this down quietly, wondering whether the king had ever actually tried counting how many pear varieties existed in his kingdom. Not every plant on that list has aged well in terms of name recognition. Alongside familiar vegetables sit names most of us have never once encountered. Colocynthus bitter melon-like plant once valued for medicine, and hazelwort, a low-creeping herb, almost nobody grows on purpose anymore. Even greater burdock made the cut, valued at the time as a proper root vegetable in its own right, long before it quietly slipped into the category most of us now simply call a weed. It is a small, quiet reminder that the line between a valued crop and an ignored plant growing at the edge of a parking lot is thinner and far more recent than most of us assume. Depending on which surviving translation you consult, historians count somewhere between about 70 and nearly 100 separate plants on that full list, medicinal herbs and flowers included alongside the vegetables. Why the disagreement over the exact number? Honestly, it comes down to a single surviving manuscript copied by hand, centuries after the original was written in Latin, that groups certain plants together in ways that sound a little different depending on who is doing the translating. One scholar's 70 plants becomes another scholar's 94 simply based on how you choose to split a comma. It is a small, almost funny reminder that even the most official document in the world is still underneath everything, just a piece of writing subject to every human quirk of language and interpretation. There is another clause in this same document that quietly impresses me every time I come back to it. Charlemagne specifically instructed his stewards to always keep good seed of the best quality on hand, whether purchased or acquired through other means, so that future harvests would never suffer from careless planting. That is essentially an early form of agricultural quality control, written into law more than 1,000 years before anyone used a phrase like supply chain management. Long before science fully explained why seed quality mattered so much, someone in Charlemagne's court had already figured out through pure practical experience that it absolutely did. There is one small detail on that list I particularly love, and I think you might too. Among all the practical instructions about beans and onions, Charlemagne specifically ordered that every gardener keep house leeks growing right on the roof of his own home. House leeks, if you are picturing something strange, are small, hardy, rosette-shaped plants that cling stubbornly to rooftops and stone walls. Medieval folklore held that they protected a building from lightning and fire. So somewhere in this enormous legal document about farm management sits a line that basically translates to also please grow a fireproof succulent directly above your own bedroom just in case. I do not know about you, but I find something wonderfully human about a powerful medieval king pausing his empire building to worry about his gardener's roofs catching fire. Where did all of this specific, almost obsessive detail actually come from Charlemagne? And his advisors were not inventing garden science from nothing. Centuries earlier, a Roman writer named Columella had written an extensive guide to farming and estate management, and copies of his work had survived quietly in monastery libraries through the centuries that followed Rome's collapse. Scholars researching the Capitula de Villis today can trace clear threads back to Columella's writing, meaning Charlemagne's garden list was not simply a personal wish, but a deliberate act of reviving old Roman agricultural knowledge and applying it by law across an entirely new empire. It fits perfectly within that broader Carolingian Renaissance I mentioned earlier, this deliberate empire-wide effort to gather up whatever fragments of Roman knowledge had survived the previous few centuries of chaos and put them back to practical use. In a very real sense, this was the Roman garden, rebuilt from old parchment replanted across medieval Europe by royal decree, and Charlemagne's curiosity about plants did not stop at his own borders either. Around this same period he exchanged gifts and letters with a ruler on the completely opposite side of the known world, Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who governed a vast and wealthy empire centered in Baghdad. Among the gifts that famously travelled from Baghdad to the Frankish court was an elephant. That elephant even had a name, Abul Abbas, and its journey from Baghdad to the Frankish court, crossing mountains and seas over the better part of a year, became one of the most talked about events of the entire period. People who had never seen anything like it in their lives reportedly travelled for days just to catch a glimpse as it passed through their region. But alongside the more dramatic gifts, new crops and plant varieties made their way west, to expanding the kinds of beans, melons and fruit trees available to European gardens for the very first time. A medieval empire, it turns out, could expand its borders with soldiers and expand its dinner table with diplomacy at exactly the same time. Now it is worth pausing here to add a little honesty to this story the same way I tried to with an earlier one. Most historians today believe the Capitula de Villis was at least in part aspirational. The very fact that Charlemagne felt the need to formally order every estate to grow these plants suggests they were not already growing there consistently. A royal decree, after all, tends to describe the world its author wishes existed, not necessarily the world exactly as it already was. Some estates almost certainly fell short of that impressive list. Others, run by more ambitious stewards eager to please a famously demanding king, likely came near that mark or exceeded it entirely. We will probably never know exactly how many gardens across the empire actually matched Charlemagne's ambitious wish list, and in a strange way that uncertainty feels appropriate. Even the most powerful ruler in Western Europe could write down exactly what he wanted, and still have no real way of knowing from his own court whether a distant steward 300 miles away was quietly ignoring half of it. Still, whether every single estate achieved it or not, the ambition itself tells us something remarkable about how Charlemagne understood power. Earlier in this journey together, we met an emperor who quietly indulged a personal craving for one particular root, treating an entire province's harvest as his own private pantry. We also spent time with a small community of nuns who kept faith and survival alive through nothing but patience and a single stubborn salt-loving plant, with no law, no decree, nothing but quiet, repeated effort passed down from one pair of hands to the next. Charlemagne did something different from both of them. He took the private pleasure of a well-tended garden and turned it into public policy, written down, copied and enforced across an entire continent. Where the emperor collected tribute for his own table, and the sisters simply kept planting out of necessity and faith, this king tried to legislate abundance itself into existence. It is a pattern you can still trace today, if you look for it in the difference between someone quietly keeping a vegetable patch behind their own house and an entire government deciding which crops deserve support, subsidy or protection on a national scale. Personal taste and public policy have always been more tangled together than we tend to admit. I find that a truly fascinating difference in how power can express itself, even across the same basic subject, a handful of vegetables in the dirt. Here's something fun to think about for a second. If you right now in your own home were handed a legal order listing exactly which vegetables you were required to grow in your backyard, would you actually follow it? Or would you quietly in some corner of the garden the inspector never checked sneak in something that was not on the list, just because you liked it better? I have a feeling I know which one most of us would choose. History. It turns out rarely changes as much as we like to think it does. The Capitulare Divilis did not simply vanish once Charlemagne's reign ended either. Copies were made, studied and referenced by garden historians for well over 1,000 years afterward, and versions of it still exist today, tucked away in archives studied by scholars trying to understand exactly what medieval Europe actually grew and ate. In a strange way, a bureaucratic farm management document meant to keep track of oxen and pigs became one of our clearest windows into an entire vanished world of medieval gardens, simply because someone centuries ago decided vegetables were important enough to write down. Walk through many traditional European gardens today, even ones that have nothing directly to do with Charlemagne, and you will still find traces of that same basic plant list, quietly repeating itself, generation after generation, almost like a memory passed down through soil instead of blood. Leeks, cabbages, parsley, mint. The exact combination one Frankish king once considered essential enough to write into law has in its own quiet way never really left European gardens at all. But laws like this one were written for royal estates' grand manors, with dozens of gardeners, stewards and stone-walled kitchen gardens, stretching across acres of carefully managed land, the kind of place where a scribe could be paid to write down 70 or 90 different plant names without anyone questioning the cost. Somewhere far away from any of that, past the edge of the royal boundary markers, in a small smoke-filled cottage with a single pot hanging low over the fire, an entirely different kind of household was quietly feeding itself with no decree to guide them. No steward keeping records, nothing but whatever grew near enough to gather, and whatever could be thrown into that pot to keep a family alive through another long cold season. Nobody wrote their story down in fine Latin script. Nobody preserved it in a royal archive for 1,000 years. But it might be the most important story in this entire journey so far, precisely because almost nobody thought to write it down at all. If nobody wrote it down, how do we actually know any of this at all? That is a fair question, and it deserves a real answer before we go any further. A few years ago, a team of archaeologists at the University of Bristol found a way to answer it that would have sounded like science fiction to anyone from the Middle Ages. Working at the site of a deserted medieval village called West Cotton in Northamptonshire, they collected broken fragments of cooking pottery, pulled from the ground, some of it buried for more than 600 years, and ran chemical tests on the inside of the shards. Cooking fat and food residue, it turns out, soaks into unglazed clay, and can survive there for centuries, quietly waiting for someone with the right equipment to come along and pull out a story it was never meant to tell. The technique itself is worth pausing on for a moment because it sounds almost like something out of a detective story rather than a history lesson. Every time a family cooked a meal in one of these pots, Tiny traces of fat and oil work their way into the clay itself, sealed in more effectively the longer the pottery stayed buried underground. Centuries later, a chemist can extract those same molecules and identify with real precision whether that pot once held beef, mutton, fish, or a stew built mostly from plants. It is one of the strange gifts archaeology occasionally hands us, the ability to taste, in a scientific sense, a meal that was eaten and forgotten, roughly 600 years before anyone in that kitchen could have imagined such a thing was even possible. It matters more than it might first seem, this kind of direct physical evidence, because so much of what survives from this period leans heavily toward the wealthy and the literate. Kings had scribes, bishops had libraries. Ordinary rural households had neither the time nor the reason to write down what they ate for supper on an unremarkable Tuesday. For centuries, historians were left piecing together peasant life from tax records, court disputes, and the occasional passing remark buried inside someone else's document, never from the peasants themselves. A chemical trace inside a broken pot does not care about any of that social hierarchy. It simply tells the truth plainly to whoever eventually thinks to ask it the right question. What they found, published by researchers named Julie Dunn and Richard Evershed, confirmed something that written history alone could never have proven with this much certainty. The everyday meal in a village like this one was a stew cooked slowly in a single pot, built mainly from vegetables such as cabbage and leek, with a little meat added in when it was available, usually beef or mutton. Not roasted feasts, not carved joints served on silver platters. A pot of vegetables simmered for hours with meat playing a supporting role rather than the starring one. Science in this case quietly corrected centuries of assumption, with nothing more than burnt fat trapped inside broken clay. I find that almost moving, if I'm honest with you. A family's actual dinner invisible to history for 6 centuries finally speaking for itself through nothing but a few cracked pieces of pottery pulled out of the dirt. Let's sit inside that pot for a moment, because it deserves more attention than a single sentence in a research paper. The word itself gives the whole story away. Pottage simply means whatever came out of the pot, and in most households that pot rarely, if ever, sat completely empty. It hung over the fire from early morning, and families added to it as the day went on, a handful of chopped cabbage here, a few peas there, whatever the garden or the market happened to offer that week. Some historians describe it almost like something that never truly finished topped up, rather than started fresh day after day, sometimes week after week, the flavours of yesterday's meal quietly blending into tomorrow's. It is not so different, really, from the slow cooker habits some of you might already keep at home, without ever thinking of it as anything historical. Have you ever kept a pot of soup going for a few days, adding a little more each time instead of starting over? If so, congratulations, you've accidentally been cooking like a medieval peasant. And if you are the kind of person who is horrified by that idea of never fully washing the pot between meals, I understand completely, but try to remember that boiling something for hours does tend to solve most of those concerns rather effectively. Cabbage and leeks made regular appearances, as we just heard from the archaeologist, but they were far from alone. Onions, garlic, peas and broad beans rounded things out, along with root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, and as we already mentioned earlier in this journey, carrots that leaned more toward deep purple than the bright orange we know today. Whatever grew in the small patch behind the house went into that pot sooner or later. Nothing much went to waste, because nothing much could afford to. The exact contents of that pot also shifted with the seasons in ways that mattered enormously to a family with no way of shipping fresh produce in from somewhere warmer. Spring and summer brought fresh greens, tender peas, whatever herbs had pushed up first after winter. Autumn meant harvesting and storing everything that could survive the cold months ahead, root vegetables buried in sand or straw, Inside a cellar, cabbages hung by their roots, from rafters peas and beans, dried thoroughly and kept in sacks. By the depths of winter, that same pot likely leaned heavily on dried stored ingredients, rather than anything freshly picked that morning, a noticeably thinner, less colourful version of the same basic meal stretched carefully to last until spring finally brought something green again. And this brings us to a myth worth clearing up properly because it comes up again and again whenever people picture this period. A lot of us imagine medieval life as one long parade of roasted meat, huge feasts, kings gnawing on turkey legs by candlelight. Hollywood loves that image, and to be fair, it makes for better cinema than a pot of simmering cabbage. But for the overwhelming majority of people during this era, meat was more of a rare treat than a daily habit. Most calories day in and day out came from bread and grain, followed closely by whatever vegetables a family could grow or gather. In a very real sense, most medieval households were eating something resembling a mostly plant-based diet, not out of any particular philosophy, but simply because meat was expensive to raise and slaughter, and vegetables, if you tended them properly, mostly were not. Bread, though, tells its own quiet story about class, and it is worth pausing here for a moment. Not all bread in this period was created equal, not by a long stretch. The finest, whitest loaves, made from carefully sifted wheat flour, and sometimes called pandemena or waste ale, depending on the region, were reserved almost entirely for lords and wealthy households. Most ordinary families ate something called maslin bread, instead a coarser, darker loaf made from a mixture of wheat and rye, or sometimes barley and rye, depending on what grew well in the local soil. In the very worst years when harvests failed and grain ran short, some families stretched what little flour they had with dried peas, or even resorted to bread meant originally for horses made from whatever grain happened to be lying around. Thick slices of bread were also used quite practically as plates, something historians now call trenchers, soaking up the juices from whatever sat on top until the bread itself was often handed off to the poor waiting near the door once the meal was finished. You could quite literally look at a slice of bread in this period and guess with reasonable accuracy roughly where someone stood in society. Now, where did the vegetables in that pot actually come from? Most peasant households were attached to a small parcel of land right beside the home itself, a plot with its own name in the historical record, a toft sometimes paired with an adjoining garden area called a croft. It was rarely more than a modest strip of ground, nothing near the sprawling estates we spent time inside earlier in this journey. And that contrast is worth sitting with for a second. One chapter of this story took us through a royal decree listing nearly 100 different plants a king expected his grand estates to grow. This chapter takes us into a garden you could walk across in under a minute, tucked behind a small timber and thatch home doing its very best to keep an entire family fed through a long, uncertain year. It is worth pausing to say too that the word peasant covers a lot more variety than we sometimes give it credit for. A wealthier villein holding 20 or 30 acres under the lord experienced a noticeably different life from a cottager, scraping by on a tiny sliver of land with barely a garden to speak of. Both would likely be lumped together under that same broad label today. But their pots and the households behind them could look meaningfully different, depending on exactly how much land and how much freedom a family actually held. It was usually the women of the household who managed that small plot, tending the vegetables, gathering herbs, keeping the pot going, while the men of the family spent long days working the lord's own fields as part of their feudal obligations. Under the manor system that shaped so much of medieval life, a peasant family typically held a portion of land just large enough to support themselves, sometimes called a vergot, in exchange for a set number of days each week labouring on the lord's own separate fields land historians refer to as the domain. Only after those unpaid duties were finished could a family turn back to their own small garden, their own small pot, their own small measure of independence. History once again rarely wrote down the names of the women managing all of this quietly in the background. We know almost nothing about most of them individually, and yet collectively their small, unglamorous daily labour kept an entire civilization fed. One modest pot of pottage at a time. Picture one of these women for a moment, if you will, somewhere in the English countryside on an ordinary morning. She wakes before the rest of the household coaxes the fire back to life from the embers, left over from the night before, and steps outside into a small garden barely larger than a modern parking space. Somewhere behind her a child too young yet for fieldwork trails along, and starts picking through the pea pods anyway, more out of boredom than usefulness, but she lets him help regardless. She gathers whatever looks ready, a few leaves of cabbage, a handful of peas still in their pods, perhaps an onion or two pulled gently from the soil. Back inside, she adds it all to the pot, already simmering over the fire, the same pot that fed her family yesterday, and likely the day before that too. There is no recipe written down anywhere for what she is making. There does not need to be. She has made this exact meal in some slightly different form hundreds of times before, and will make it hundreds of times again. Meanwhile, her husband is already gone out toward the Lord's fields with the other men of the village, where he'll spend the greater part of his day ploughing, weeding, or harvesting land that will never belong to him, fulfilling the labour he owes simply for the right to keep his own small plot and his own small home. He will not see that garden again until the light starts fading in the evening, tired in a way that has very little patience left for anything beyond a warm bowl and an early night. Whatever waits in that pot when he finally sits down is not a luxury to him. It is the entire point of the day having been worth surviving at all. Can you imagine running an entire household kitchen with just one pot, one fire, and whatever your own small patch of dirt happened to produce that week? No refrigerator, no pantry stocked with backup options, just the garden, the pot, and whatever skill and patience a person had built up over a lifetime of doing this exact same work. There is something quietly remarkable in that kind of ordinary competence, the sort that never gets written into official histories, because nobody at the time considered it particularly noteworthy. Kings get chroniclers, wars get chronicled in painstaking detail. But the woman who kept her family fed for 40 consecutive winters, using nothing more than a garden the size of a small room, rarely gets so much as a single line in any surviving document. Even the very word we use for people like her peasant comes from an old word simply meaning someone tied to the land, as if her entire identity could be reduced to where she happened to stand. If archaeologists had not eventually thought to test the chemistry hiding inside broken pottery, we might still be guessing at what truly sustained most people through this entire period of history. I think there is something worth carrying with us from that. The grandest, most official version of history, the one written in royal decrees and Latin manuscripts, and celebrated by name for centuries afterward, was never actually the version most people experienced. Most people spent their days inside a much smaller story, one pot, one garden, one ordinary day, quietly following the last largely unrecorded and almost entirely unremembered. And yet that smaller, quieter story is the one that truly kept civilization standing meal after meal, season after season, for longer than any single king's reign ever managed. But even that small garden, modest as it was, could not always be relied upon. Some years the rain arrived at the wrong time or refused to arrive at all, and the little toft behind the house produced next to nothing worth adding to the pot. In those years, when even the humble cabbage and leek could not be counted on families' reach for something else entirely, a plant that did not need careful tending did not ask for good soil or gentle weather, and seemed to grow almost out of spite for how little attention anyone gave it. That plant earned itself a nickname that has outlasted most royal titles handed out during this entire period, and its story is where we are headed next. The nickname in question sounds at first like it belongs to nobility. Good King Henry. Say it out loud and it practically demands a throne, a crown, maybe a portrait hanging in some drafty castle hallway somewhere. And yet the plant carrying that grand title around for the last several hundred years has absolutely nothing to do with any actual king named Henry. Not one. Which honestly might be my favourite kind of historical detail, the sort where the name itself turns out to be a small, harmless lie repeated so often for so long that almost everyone simply accepted it as fact. I have to admit, the first time I learned this, I felt a little betrayed on behalf of every gardener who ever planted this thing, assuming they were growing something with a real royal pedigree. But stick with me, because the true origin story is in its own quiet way even more charming than the fake one. It involves elves' mistaken identity and at least one enthusiastic Tudor-era writer with a serious flair for exaggeration. The real story starts in German-speaking Europe long before English gardeners ever got their hands on this plant. German folk tradition had a habit of naming household plants after minor spirits, the kind of playful, half-believed folklore where a small unseen presence might occupy your garden, your hearth, or your cellar. One especially common name for these little household spirits was Heinrich or Henry, a name attached to friendly, harmless kobolds, thought to wander quietly through farmyards and gardens. So when this particular leafy green earned a reputation as safe, nourishing, and reliably helpful around the home, it picked up the name Guter Heinrich, meaning Good Henry, to set it apart from an entirely different, far more dangerous plant nicknamed Böser Heinrich, or Bad Henry, a toxic woodland plant that shares almost nothing with this one, except an unfortunate resemblance and an unlucky name. Confuse the two in the wrong season apparently, and you would understand very quickly why one of them earned the word bad. By the time this humble green crossed into English gardens and English herbal books, someone likely a Tudor-era writer looking to make an already respectable little plant sound even more impressive quietly upgraded Henry to King Henry. Most historians studying this today agree the royal title was simply invented tacked on for a bit of flair, with no actual English monarch behind it at all. So the next time somebody tells you history is only ever exactly what happened, you can mention that one of Europe's most reliable vegetables spent the last several centuries wearing a royal title that a marketing-minded herbalist essentially made up. It is a strange little echo of a story we already told earlier in this journey. One vegetable actually did sit on the table of a real King Henry. This one simply borrowed his name and never once came anywhere near a royal kitchen. The plant's other common nickname tells you far more about its actual life than the invented royal one ever could poor man's asparagus. Its young spring shoots, tender and mild, could be cut boiled briefly, and served much the way a wealthier household might prepare real asparagus, a vegetable that at the time carried a certain expensive, delicate reputation of its own. For a family who could never afford anything resembling a luxury vegetable, this humble green offered something near that same experience gathered for nothing more than the effort of bending down and pulling it from the ground. There is something quietly touching about that a family finding their own small version of luxury, not by buying it, but simply by knowing where to look. Historical records place this plant firmly on ordinary tables from around the 12th century through the 16th, showing up again and again in the same kinds of vegetable soups. We spent time inside a moment ago, simmered together with leeks charred and whatever bread scraps could be spared to thicken the pot. It was not a special occasion food. It was Tuesday. It was Wednesday. It was simply what a sensible household added to the pot when little else was ready to harvest. Old English herbals from the 16th century onward routinely listed it right alongside cabbage and spinach, treating it as an unremarkable everyday garden vegetable worth, including precisely because it was so common that leaving it out would have felt like an oversight. And its usefulness did not stop with the shoots in springtime either. Later in the season, the plant sends up small broccoli-like flower buds, which some households picked and cooked, the exact same way you might treat any other tender green vegetable today. Practically every part of the plant found some use. Eventually leaves for greens, shoots for something resembling asparagus buds, for something resembling broccoli, all from a single hardy plant that nobody had to plant twice, since its thick root would simply send up new growth again the following spring without any help at all. Botanically speaking, this plant belongs to a group scientist named Chenopodium, built from two old Greek words, chen meaning goose and paus meaning foot, a nod to the shape of its broad, slightly triangular leaves, which do bear a passing resemblance to a goose's webbed foot if you use a little imagination. Young leaves carry a faint silvery, almost dusty coating, and the whole plant tends to grow low and sturdy, sending down a single thick taproot that can anchor it firmly in the same patch of ground for years without anyone needing to replant a single seed. English speakers picked up plenty of other nicknames for this same plant too, depending on which part of the country you happen to call home. In Lincolnshire, it went by the name Lincolnshire spinach, standing in for real spinach, long before that vegetable became a common garden staple across England. Elsewhere it was simply called markery or English mercury, that last name creating yet another layer of confusion alongside its poisonous German cousin, since mercury in old plant naming tradition seems to have been a favourite label for an entire tangled family of similar-looking greens, some perfectly safe, some decidedly not. I like to imagine some patient greengrocer in Lincolnshire centuries ago explaining for the 100th time that no, this was not in fact real spinach, just something that did the same job rather admirably. And this is exactly where its story becomes so important to the one we just finished telling. Remember that small, carefully tended garden plot behind a peasant home entirely dependent on a decent soil and reasonably cooperative weather. Good King Henry did not need any of that. It thrived in waste ground alongside farmyards near old dwellings on roadside verges nobody bothered tending at all. It tolerated poor, disturbed soil that would have disappointed cabbage or leeks completely. When the weather turned against a family's careful planting, when the rain arrived too late or too hard, this particular green kept growing regardless, almost indifferent to whatever misfortune had ruined everything else. Picture for a moment a household with even less than the modest toft we spent time inside earlier, a landless labourer's family perhaps with no real garden plot of their own to speak of at all, only whatever small patch of ground nobody else had claimed near their door. There was no careful planning here, no rows, no seed saved from last year's harvest. There was simply a woman walking the same worn path most mornings past the same fence line, the same patch of waste ground, behind the same neighbour's wall, gathering whatever good King Henry had managed to send up since her last visit. She did not plant this. Nobody did. It was simply there faithfully, the way a good neighbour tends to be asking nothing and offering something anyway. Her children trail behind her, sometimes learning without ever being formally taught, the way children in every era learn the things that actually matter, simply by watching a parent do something enough times that it starts to feel like instinct rather than knowledge. One day, without anyone deciding to teach a lesson, they will know exactly which leaves to choose and which to leave behind, the same quiet inheritance passed to them that was once passed to her. It is not the kind of knowledge that ends up in any book. It simply survives quietly inside families the same stubborn way The plant itself survives inside a neglected patch of ground nobody thought worth ploughing, and it was not simply filling a gap out of desperation either. Modern nutritional analysis shows good King Henry carries meaningful amounts of iron, calcium, and vitamin C, exactly the kind of nutrients a family surviving mostly on bread and grain would have been chronically short on. A mother feeding young children through a lean season without any real understanding of nutrition science would nonetheless have known through pure hands-on experience passed down from her own mother that this particular plant kept her family stronger through the hardest stretches of the year. It is worth pausing on that for a second. Long before anyone could explain why in scientific terms, ordinary people had already worked out through generations of quiet trial and error exactly which plants kept a body going and which ones did not. Its usefulness reached beyond the dinner table too in ways worth a quick mention before we move into the next part of tonight's story properly. Village healers sometimes recommended the leaves crushed into a simple poultice for cleaning and soothing minor sores and skin irritations, and the plant carried a gentle reputation as a gut-settling remedy as well. None of this made it a miracle cure by any means, but it does show in a small and practical way just how thoroughly this humble plant wove itself into the daily rhythm of an ordinary household, feeding the family, feeding the chickens, and occasionally tending a scraped knee, all from the very same patch of ground nobody had bothered to plant in the first place. The plant carried yet another nickname worth mentioning: Fat Hen earned, because the very same leaves fed to a hungry family were often fed to the household's chickens too, fattening them up efficiently on a plant that cost nothing but the time it took to pull it from the ground. One quiet green weed doing double duty, feeding both the family directly and the animals that would eventually feed the family again. There would come certain years later in this story when almost everything else in a family's garden failed outright, when harvest collapsed across entire regions, and desperation reached almost unimaginable levels. We will get to that darker chapter before this night is through. For now it is enough to say that a plant this stubborn, this willing to grow practically anywhere, made an enormous quiet difference long before any true catastrophe ever arrived. Good King Henry was not simply a poor family's vegetable. It was something more like an insurance policy nobody had to pay for. Have you ever discovered as an adult that something you always assumed was simply a weed growing in the corner of a yard or a crack in the sidewalk was actually, historically speaking, somebody's dinner? I think about that more than I probably should these days every time I walk past an overgrown lot, and wonder what a medieval cook would have seen growing there instead of what I see. Here is where this particular story takes a noticeably different turn from the one we told about that sweet sugary root earlier in this journey. That root lost its place at the table because something more efficient eventually outcompeted it, a straightforward, almost business-like kind of defeat. Good King Henry was not defeated by any competitor at all. Nothing replaced it directly. Instead, sometime around the early 20th century, as gardening habits modernized and store-bought vegetables became widely available, this plant simply slipped out of cultivated gardens and back into the wild margins. It had always been perfectly happy growing in any way. Modern gardening guides today typically list it under a single unglamorous heading, common weed, with barely a mention of the centuries it once spent feeding entire villages. Botanists studying old cottage garden sites often still find it growing there generation after generation of the exact same patch, a quiet green ghost of a garden that has not existed for 100 years. In parts of Ireland, botanical surveys have tracked this exact decline in real time, noting the plant thriving reliably around old cottage gardens for generations, then simply vanishing from entire counties within a single lifetime, not through any dramatic event, but through nothing more than gardens changing hands, habits changing, and nobody bothering to notice a familiar green disappearing from view. The recipe never really left, only the label changed. 1 century it was dinner. The next, to almost everyone who walked past it, it was simply a weed. I find that particular kind of disappearance more unsettling in a way than losing a competition to a better vegetable. Nobody voted this plant out for tasting worse or growing less reliably. We just quietly stopped calling it food, and once a name changes, so does everything that follows from it. Nobody forages through a weed patch expecting dinner, but rename that exact same patch a forgotten kitchen garden. And suddenly, people start looking at it very differently. The plant never changed at all. Only the story we chose to tell about it did. Maybe that is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. How many ordinary, overlooked things in your own life, a habit, a skill, a person quietly deserve a better name than the one we have carelessly given them? And if a name has that much power over something as simple as a vegetable, it makes you wonder what else in our own lives might simply be waiting for someone to call it by a better one. So far, everything we have wandered through together has come down to what people put on a plate or into a pot and why. But medieval people rarely drew as clean a line between food and medicine as we tend to draw today. A great many of these same plants, including some we've already met, were understood as something more like quiet everyday healing tucked directly into an ordinary meal. And nobody documented that overlap between food and medicine more thoroughly or more thoughtfully than one remarkable woman whose writing still shapes how historians understand medieval healing today. Her name was Hildegard, and by the time she passed away in the year 1179, she'd already spent roughly 8 decades that most people alive today would struggle to fit into 3 separate lifetimes. She was born into a landowning family in the German Rhineland, and as the story goes, she was likely the 10th child, which mattered a great deal in a period when a family's 10th child was sometimes offered to the church as a kind of human tithe. She was given over to a religious life as a young girl somewhere between the age of 8 and 14, depending on which record you trust enclosed within monastery walls, before she had any real say in the matter. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. A little girl handed over almost as a form of payment who would go on to become one of the most towering intellectual figures of her entire century. Her early companion and teacher inside those monastery walls, an older recluse named Jutta, taught her scripture, but had little formal education herself to pass along, which makes what Hildegard eventually accomplished on her own initiative all the more remarkable. From a young age she reported visions, flashes of light and sound she believed carried messages from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. For years she kept this mostly to herself, unsure whether to trust it, unsure whether anyone else would trust it either. Eventually encouraged by those around her, she began writing these visions down, and what started as a private, uncertain habit slowly grew into an enormous body of theological, scientific, and medical work that popes and emperors would eventually take seriously enough to seek her counsel directly. She earned herself a nickname during her own lifetime, the Sibyl of the Rhine, and composed music so distinctive that historians now count her among the very first named composers in the entire Western tradition. Her soaring, unusual melodies still performed and recorded by choirs today. Even near the very end of her life, her convictions never softened. When church authorities once tried to punish her community by forbidding them from singing a devastating penalty for a woman who believed music was the closest a human voice could come to touching the divine, Hildegard pushed back with everything she had left, arguing her case until the punishment was finally lifted only months before she died. We've met her briefly once or twice already on this journey together, tucked into a quick mention here and there. She deserves considerably more than that because she sits at the very centre of tonight's story. Here is something worth pausing on. Throughout this journey, we've run into woman after woman whose name history simply failed to record: the sisters tending a coastal garden, the wife keeping a single pot going through a long winter, the mother gathering greens from a patch of waste ground nobody else claimed. Hildegard breaks that pattern entirely. Her name survived. Her writing survived. Her music is still recorded and performed today, nearly 900 years later, by choirs who have never set foot anywhere near the Rhineland monastery where she once spent her days. In a period that offered women remarkably few paths toward any kind of public voice, she built one anyway, through sheer force of insight and frankly considerable stubbornness. Alongside her visionary writing, Hildegard produced a remarkable medical and scientific text called Physica, a careful catalogue of plants, animals, and minerals, along with detailed notes on how each one affected the human body. Her curiosity ranged astonishingly wide. She wrote about common garden staples like watercress, radish, and cabbage, alongside far rarer, more exotic arrivals such as the lemon, a fruit most people in her part of Germany would rarely, if ever, have actually tasted for themselves, and even flowers we would now consider purely decorative like peonies and primroses, which she still managed to work into her framework of healing and balance. You might remember from earlier in this journey a certain sweet root that was described as hot and dry in her writing. At the time, I let that detail pass by fairly quickly. It deserves a proper explanation now, because that single phrase, hot and dry, was not just a poetic description. It was a precise diagnosis, drawn from an entire medical system that shaped how nearly everyone in medieval Europe thought about food, illness, and the human body itself. That system rested on an idea inherited from ancient Greek medicine, refined over centuries, and taken almost entirely for granted by the time Hildegard was writing. The human body, according to this theory, was governed by 4 internal fluids called humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour carried 2 defining qualities paired from the options hot or cold and wet or dry. Blood was considered hot and wet. Phlegm was cold and wet. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. Good health depended entirely on keeping these 4 fluids in careful balance. Too much of any single humour and a person would tip into illness, foul moods, or physical weakness, depending on which fluid had gained the upper hand. And here is where it connects directly back to the garden. Every single food, herb, and vegetable was believed to carry its own humoral qualities too, its own private blend of hot or cold, wet or dry. Cucumbers and lettuce were considered cool and moist, gentle enough to calm an overheated temperament. Ginger, by contrast, was considered hot and moist, the kind of thing you might reach for if your own system had grown too cold and sluggish. A physician, or in most rural communities, a monk or nun trained in this same tradition, could look at a patient, consider their symptoms, their complexion, even the season of the year, and prescribe specific foods meant to nudge the body's humours back toward balance. Can you think of a food you still instinctively describe as warming or cooling? Even now, without ever having studied a single page of ancient Greek medicine, I suspect most of us do this, constantly reaching for something warm and heavy on a cold night, something light and crisp on a hot afternoon, carrying a little fragment of this old system around with us, without ever realizing it. Picture for a moment what an actual consultation might have looked like inside one of these communities. A tenant farmer arrives at the monastery gate complaining of restless nights and a stomach that refuses to settle. The sister tasked with tending the sick studies. His flushed face asks a few careful questions about his appetite and his temper. Lately, and quietly concludes his body has tipped too far toward hot and dry. She does not reach for a bottle of medicine sealed behind a counter somewhere far away. She walks out into the same garden that fed the community's supper the night before, and returns with something cool and moist enough in her understanding to nudge him back toward balance. The garden was the pharmacy. The gardener was quite often the physician too. This is precisely why monastery gardens across medieval Europe so often doubled as something more like an outdoor pharmacy. The very same patch of dirt that grew vegetables for the dinner pot also grew the specific plants a community's healer would reach for the moment somebody fell ill. There was rarely a hard line between the two purposes. The herbs that flavoured a stew on Tuesday might be the exact same herbs steeped into a tea for a fever on Wednesday. Historians today sometimes use the term physic garden for spaces designed specifically around this dual purpose, and remarkably a handful of gardens built on this exact same old idea still exist and still grow, today open to visitors tended now more for historical interest than genuine medical necessity. Surviving museums of a worldview most of us have almost entirely forgotten. Walk through one now, and you will find neat rows of plants labelled not by flavour or dinner recipe, but by ailment. This one for fevers, that one for wounds, another for troubled sleep, an entire vegetable patch quietly organised as a working medical library. Hildegard's own writing captures this blending beautifully. She did not separate her botanical notes into tidy categories of food plants over here, medicine plants over there. A single entry might describe a plant's taste, its best growing conditions, its humoral temperature, and its recommended use for a specific ailment, all within the same short passage written with the calm, practical confidence of someone who fully expected her readers to use this information at their own kitchen table. There is a deeper concept running underneath all of Hildegard's writing too, one word she returned to again and again throughout her life, viriditas roughly translated as greenness or the greening power. For Hildegard, this was not simply a description of plant colour. It represented a kind of vital energy she believed flowed through all of nature, connecting a sprouting seed, a healthy human body, and the divine itself into one continuous breathing system. Illness in her framework was not just a humoral imbalance. It was in some sense a loss of that greening vitality, a person becoming a little less alive than they were meant to be. Healing then meant helping that vitality return, and what better way to invite vitality back into a struggling body than through the very plant she believed carried it most abundantly. It is a lovely image if you sit with it, a whole worldview built on the idea that gardens and bodies were never truly separate things to begin with, simply two different expressions of the exact same quiet green persistence. A tired field turning green again each spring, and a tired body recovering its strength after illness, were to her mind the very same miracle happening at two different scales. I find something quietly beautiful in that idea even 8 centuries later, even knowing how much of the underlying science has since been proven wrong. There is real comfort in imagining illness not as some hostile invader to be aggressively destroyed, but simply as a temporary dimming of something naturally alive within you, waiting patiently to be coaxed back into bloom. Now it would be easy looking back from where we stand today to dismiss all of this as pure superstition, 4 mysterious fluids and a made-up word for green vitality. I want to gently push back on that instinct if you will let me. This was not random guesswork. It was an internally consistent, carefully reasoned system, built and refined over many centuries by serious thinkers doing their honest best with the observational tools available to them. They watched, they recorded, they adjusted their theories when treatments failed and tried again. That is not so different structurally from how medicine still operates today, just working from a completely different starting map of how the human body actually functions. And consider this for a moment too. This particular medical framework, unfamiliar as it might feel to us now, guided doctors and healers across most of Europe for well over 1,000 years, from ancient Greece straight through the medieval period and stretching well into the age of Shakespeare. Almost nothing in modern medicine has lasted nearly that long without being significantly revised. Whatever else you want to say about the four humours, they were not some brief fad. They were the dominant medical framework for a length of time that dwarfs the entire existence of modern science as we currently practice it. There was one more layer to this entire worldview worth introducing tonight, a concept that would eventually attach itself to some of the strangest, most memorable plants in this entire story. Many medieval healers believed that nature left clues about a plant's medical purpose hidden directly inside its appearance. A plant shaped a certain way or coloured a certain way was thought to be nature quietly pointing toward exactly what ailment it was meant to treat. A spotted leaf resembling a diseased lung might be recommended for breathing troubles. A walnut cracked open to reveal something resembling two small folded hemispheres was sometimes recommended for troubles of the mind simply because of how closely it resembled the organ it was thought to help. Historians now often call this the doctrine of signatures, and once you know to look for it, you start noticing it tucked into medieval herbals again and again, this quiet, hopeful belief that nature had already written its own instruction manual if only you knew how to interpret the shapes correctly. Have you ever noticed yourself doing something similar? Reaching instinctively for a specific food when you feel unwell, warm broth for a cold, something bright and citrus when you need cheering up, without ever really stopping to ask yourself why that particular food feels like the right one? I do not think that instinct has fully left us even now, buried under supermarket aisles and pharmacy counters that insist on keeping food and medicine in entirely separate buildings. And that separation, when you sit with it for a moment, is in truth a fairly recent invention. For most of human history, including every single chapter we have wandered through together so far tonight, the plate and the pharmacy were simply the same small garden, viewed through two different, equally sincere lenses. Hildegard never would have understood our modern instinct to draw such a firm line between the two. To her, and to nearly everyone around her, a vegetable was never just a vegetable. It was potential nourishment, potential remedy, and if you followed her thinking all the way through, a small vital piece of something greater, quietly growing in the dirt behind your own home. I sometimes wonder what she would make of a modern grocery store aisles neatly divided between produce and pharmaceuticals, as though the two had nothing whatsoever to say to each other anymore. I suspect she would find the whole arrangement a little sad, honestly. Two departments quietly ignoring how much they once had in common. There was one plant in particular appearing again and again across medieval herbals, whose entire reputation rested almost completely on this idea that appearance reveals purpose. Its dark, twisted root looked so unmistakably like something dangerous that healers became convinced it must hold the cure for the very danger it resembled. That root is where we are headed next. Picture a root pulled fresh from cold ground, dark-skinned, almost black, twisting slightly as it comes free from the soil, longer and thinner than anything sitting in your refrigerator drawer right now. Its surface looks rough, almost reptilian, catching what little winter light there is in a dull, dark sheen. Snap it in half, and the inside tells a completely different story. Pure white, faintly milky, nothing at all like the shadowy exterior might suggest. Medieval hands pulling this exact root from a monastery garden bed centuries ago looked at that dark, twisting shape and thought almost instantly of one thing: a snake. And once a plant reminds an entire culture of something dangerous, that culture tends to draw one of two conclusions. Either the plant itself must be dangerous too, Or following that same doctrine we just finished exploring together, the plant must exist specifically to cure whatever danger it resembles. This particular root earned itself the second reputation, and honestly it is not hard to see why. Hold one up in dim candlelight dirt still clinging to its ridges, and the resemblance to a small coiled serpent is almost impossible to unsee once somebody points it out to you. Healers across parts of Europe sincerely believed this dark, snake-like root could treat snake bites, an idea so persistent it worked its way directly into the plant's own name. Italian speakers called it scorzone, meaning black viper, and the name scorzonera stuck carried forward through language after language until it landed more or less unchanged on modern seed packets and restaurant menus today. Let's be honest with each other for a moment, the way I try to be throughout this whole story. Scorzonera does not cure snake bites. There is no compound hiding inside that root capable of neutralizing venom, no matter how confidently medieval herbals insisted otherwise. The doctrine of signatures, that lovely hopeful idea that nature leaves visible clues about a plant's healing purpose, simply got this one wrong. And I think that is actually worth sitting with for a second rather than rushing past it. A belief system can be thoughtful, consistent, and sincerely reasoned, built by intelligent people doing their honest best, and still occasionally arrive at a conclusion that turns out to be flatly untrue. That does not make the whole framework foolish, it makes it human. We do the exact same thing today, reasoning carefully from the best evidence available to us, and still sometimes landing on an answer that later turns out to be completely wrong. The method was not the failure. The information simply had limits nobody could see yet. Future generations will very likely look back at a few of our own confident, well-reasoned beliefs, the exact same way we now look back at this one with a small forgiving smile rather than outright ridicule. Have you ever held on to a belief for years, something that made perfect sense at the time only to eventually learn it simply was not true? I suspect most of us have a small collection of those tucked away somewhere. Scorzonera's snakebite reputation was simply one of medieval Europe's. Whatever it failed to cure, though this root more than earned its place at the table, through an entirely different talent, one with nothing to do with snakes at all. Peel away that dark, slightly bitter skin, and the pale flesh underneath carries a truly surprising flavour, something remarkably similar to oysters. Cooks across centuries noticed this same comparison, independently in different countries, different languages, all landing on roughly the same description for a plant that grows nowhere near the ocean. That single detail earned it a whole cluster of nicknames built entirely around seafood: black oyster root, oyster plant, vegetable, oyster, a landlocked root, somehow convincing generation after generation of cooks that they were tasting something pulled from the sea. Cooks eventually built entire dishes around leaning into that comparison, directly simmering the sliced root gently in butter and cream until it took on a texture almost identical to a delicately poached oyster, then serving it exactly the way a coastal kitchen might serve the real thing as a small rich first course meant to impress. Families settled hundreds of miles from any coastline who might never once taste an actual oyster in their entire lives could still sit down to something that captured, at least in spirit, that same rich, briny indulgence grown quietly in their own back garden the whole time. Scorzonera was not travelling alone through history either. It has a near-relative white salsify, a slightly paler, thinner root from the very same general plant family, sharing that same faintly oceanic flavour, but wearing an entirely different disguise above ground. Where Scorzonera produces small yellow flowers, white salsify sends up striking purple ones, and when the flower eventually goes to seed, it transforms into a large silvery puff, so delicate and eye-catching, that ancient Greek writers nicknamed the plant billy goat's beard, imagining the wispy seed head as some strange vegetable imitation of an old goat's chin. The two roots are similar enough in flavour and texture that most historical recipes simply treat them as interchangeable, yet different enough in appearance that a gardener walking between two rows would never mistake one plant for the other. Some households grew both side by side purely for the pleasure of comparing them, the way a modern gardener might grow two slightly different heirloom tomatoes just to argue every summer about which one actually tastes better. I love that detail, honestly. Somewhere in ancient Greece, someone looked at a seed head blowing gently in a field and thought unmistakably of a goat. History rarely tells us who that person was, but their little joke stuck around for roughly 2,000 years, which is more staying power than most modern jokes manage to achieve by next Tuesday. The Romans were fond of this whole family of roots too in ways that had nothing to do with snake cures or superstition. The famous Roman gourmet Apicius, whose name survives attached to an entire collection of ancient recipes, developed several dishes built specifically around salsify, treating it as a genuine delicacy, worth real culinary attention, worthy of the same careful spicing and rich sauces reserved for far more expensive ingredients on a wealthy household's table. Archaeologists working at Pompeii have even found the plant depicted in preserved wall paintings frozen in fresco form, at the exact moment the city itself was frozen in time. A small, unglamorous root immortalized purely by historical accident alongside far grander imagery of gods and feasts. It is a strange kind of fame being remembered for 2,000 years, not because anyone set out to celebrate you, but simply because a painter happened to be hungry that particular afternoon. By the time we move forward into the medieval period, monks had taken a particular liking to white salsify, specifically cultivating it deliberately within their garden walls for one especially practical reason. Most vegetables, once the cold months arrived, needed to be harvested, dried, or carefully stored to survive winter at all. Salsify needed none of that. Left undisturbed in the ground, it simply waited there patiently through frost, through snow, through the harshest stretches of the entire year, ready to be pulled fresh the moment somebody actually wanted it. Picture a monk cloak pulled tight against a bitter January morning, walking out to a garden bed that looks at first glance completely dead. No green shows above the frozen soil at all. He digs anyway, breaking through a thin crust of frost with a small hand tool, and there it is, a cluster of pale, patient roots, exactly where he left them months earlier, unbothered by an entire winter passing overhead. Peeled and prepared that same afternoon, it produced something startlingly similar to fresh asparagus, at a time of year when real asparagus would not appear again for months. Small wonder some cooks eventually nicknamed it winter asparagus, a small miracle of patience quietly waiting underground while everything else in the garden slept. For households without the luxury of a sheltered monastery garden, there was another option too. Roots dug up before the very hardest frost arrived could be packed carefully into boxes of damp sand and tucked away in a cold cellar, keeping perfectly well for months at a stretch, a little slower to reach than simply digging fresh from the ground, but every bit as reliable. Between the two methods, leaving it buried outdoors or storing it indoors in sand, a careful household could reasonably expect some version of this root on the table nearly any week of the entire winter, an almost unheard of luxury for a season that offered so little else in the way of fresh green flavour. Now here is a small mystery buried inside Scorzonera's own name, one I find thoroughly delightful once you notice it. Despite that confident-sounding Spanish botanical label Hispanica, suggesting a clear Spanish origin, the earliest written mention of the plant anywhere in Europe does not come from Spain at all. It comes from a travelling naturalist who in the year 1575 recorded seeing scorzonera being sold in a market in Aleppo, in what is now Syria, thousands of miles from the country its own scientific name claims to honour. Nobody today can say with total certainty exactly how the wrong geography ended up baked permanently into the plant's official title. Perhaps an early botanist simply assumed a Spanish source without checking carefully, or perhaps the plant truly did pass through Spanish hands on its way toward wider European gardens before anyone thought to write the moment down. But once a name gets attached firmly enough, accurate or not, it tends to simply stay attached, the same stubborn pattern we've already run into more than once on this journey together. Cooking. Either one of these roots, salsify or scorzonera, comes with one small sticky complication worth mentioning, mostly because I think you will enjoy imagining it. The moment you peel either root, it releases a thin, sticky latex that clings to your hands and, if you're not careful, begins turning the exposed flesh an unappetizing shade of brown, within minutes oxidizing almost as fast as you can work. Careful cooks learn to peel the roots directly under running water, or drop them immediately into water mixed with a little lemon or vinegar, holding the oxidation at bay long enough to get the vegetables safely into the pot. It is a small, fussy, slightly messy step, the kind of detail that never makes it into a poetic description of medieval cuisine, but absolutely shaped how real cooks in real kitchens spent their actual afternoons, muttering no doubt about their sticky fingers the entire time. Can you imagine standing over a basin of cold water for 20 minutes, patiently peeling root after sticky root, purely because you know the payoff at the end will taste faintly, improbably like oysters? I think there is something wonderful in that kind of quiet culinary devotion, the willingness to put up with a thoroughly annoying process simply because the result is worth it. Salsify and scorzonera carried this same steady popularity forward for an extraordinarily long stretch of history through the medieval period, straight through the elegant tables of Victorian households, and lingering on well into the early decades of the 20th century. And then fairly quickly, by historical standards, they largely vanished from everyday kitchens. This decline looks nothing like the ones we've already traced together on this journey. Nobody outlawed the plant. No competing vegetable elbowed it aside through sheer efficiency. What actually happened was quieter and in its own way more modern. Mechanical refrigeration spread rapidly through the late 1800s, and into the new century, and alongside it came faster rail networks and steamships, capable of moving fresh produce across entire oceans before it ever had the chance to spoil. Suddenly, asparagus and artichokes could show up fresh on a table almost any month of the year, shipped in from somewhere warmer, no longer tied to the slow, patient rhythm of local seasons at all. Grocers who once relied on a handful of hardy, patient vegetables to fill the gap between autumn and spring suddenly had entire crates of delicate summer produce arriving by rail in the dead of winter, and shoppers understandably found the novelty rather hard to resist. Salsify's entire reputation had been built around one specific precious talent, patiently surviving underground through winter to provide something fresh when nothing else could. The moment that particular problem stopped needing solving, so much of the plant's quiet appeal simply evaporated along with it. It was not defeated. It was not reclassified into uselessness the way we saw happen earlier in this story. It was simply rendered gently and almost accidentally unnecessary by an entirely new kind of convenience nobody could have predicted centuries earlier. I find that a strangely touching way for a vegetable story to fade, honestly. This root spent hundreds of years being valued precisely for its patience, its willingness to wait quietly beneath frozen ground until somebody truly needed it. And the very technology that eventually made our lives easier also quietly made that particular kind of patience feel to most people entirely beside the point. There is something worth sitting with in that something that reaches a little beyond vegetables. How many quiet, patient virtues in our own lives have slowly become unnecessary, not because they stopped being admirable, but simply because the world eventually solved the exact problem they were built to answer? I do not think that makes patience worthless. I think it just means patience, like this root, occasionally has to wait quietly for a world that has stopped needing it in quite the same urgent way it once did. So far tonight we've wandered through gardens shaped by faith, by law, by hunger, and by careful medical theory. But medieval kitchens were not only interested in vegetables that behaved sensibly, filled a gap, or matched some careful reasoned system of health. Some plants earned their place at the table for a far stranger reason, entirely simply because people stubbornly, wholeheartedly enjoyed flavours that most of us today would find almost impossible to sit through a single bite of. Let me describe a vegetable to you before I even tell you its name, because I want you to sit with the description for a moment first. Picture something tall, almost architectural, with broad, silvery green leaves edged in sharp little spines, growing up out of the ground like a cross between a giant thistle and something you might find guarding the entrance to an enchanted garden in an old fairy tale. Left alone in an open field, it can rise well past waist height, thick stalks fanning outward, topped eventually by a spiky purple flower head that looks almost aggressive enough to defend itself. Touch one of those unopened flower heads, and you understand immediately why nobody ever mistook this plant for something delicate. Snap off a raw stalk and bite into it, and your mouth fills almost instantly with a bitterness so sharp, so aggressive, that most modern taste buds would spit it straight back out within seconds. And yet for hundreds of years across parts of Europe, cooks did not just tolerate this plant. They treasured it, built entire elaborate dishes around it, and considered a table without it noticeably poorer for its absence. This is the cardoon, a near relative of the artichoke, and it is exactly the kind of flavour we promised to explore together, the kind most of us today would honestly struggle to sit through a single bite of. Its wild ancestors grew across the Mediterranean long before anyone thought to cultivate them deliberately, and even today in parts of southern Europe, cardoon remains a genuine seasonal delicacy, rather than some forgotten curiosity showing up at winter markets, the way pumpkin might show up at an autumn stand somewhere else in the world. Here is where the story gets interesting, though, because medieval and Renaissance cooks were not simply gritting their teeth through unbearable bitterness for centuries out of stubbornness. They developed a clever, patient technique for taming it first. Weeks before harvest, gardeners would gather the tall stalks together and wrap them tightly, sometimes in straw, sometimes in paper, blocking out sunlight almost entirely. Deprived of light, the plant produces far less of the chemical compounds responsible for that harsh, aggressive bitterness, and the stalks slowly pale from vivid green toward a soft, creamy white. This process, called blanching, is the exact same basic trick still used on ordinary celery today, though. Almost nobody buying a stalk of celery at the supermarket realizes they are looking at the tame descendant of an old technique first perfected on a much fiercer plant. It took real patience too, weeks of careful wrapping and waiting, checking that the bindings had not loosened, that no stray gap of sunlight had slipped through to spoil the whole batch. A gardener growing cardoon was making a quiet, deliberate bet weeks in advance, betting an entire crop on darkness, doing its slow, invisible work correctly. There was no way to check the results early either, no way to peek beneath the wrapping and confirm progress without disturbing the very darkness the whole process depended on. You simply trusted the method because everyone before you had trusted it too, and unwrap the stalks only when the calendar, not curiosity, told you it was finally time. Once properly blanched, cardoon transforms into something entirely different on the plate, still carrying a distinctive, faintly bitter edge, but mellow enough now to become truly delicious, rather than simply endurable. Renaissance cooks braised it slowly in rich broth, baked it beneath layers of cheese, or paired it with butter and bone marrow, treating it as a genuine delicacy, worth real culinary ambition. The kind of dish a wealthy household might proudly serve to impress a visiting guest. Picture the kitchen the night before such a feast. A cook carefully unwrapping stalk after pale stalk from their straw bindings, trimming away the sharp outer spines with practiced hands, then simmering the tender centres gently in broth until they turned soft enough to yield to the gentlest pressure of a spoon. Nothing about that process was quick. Nothing about it was accidental. Every single stage, from the first wrapping in the field to the final dish reaching the table, demanded a kind of patient attention most of us reserve today for very few meals at all. A household willing to invest that much careful labour into a single vegetable was in its own quiet way making a small public statement about how seriously they took the art of feeding their guests well. Have you ever pushed through something truly unpleasant at first, purely because you trusted there was something worthwhile waiting on the other side of the effort? I think cardoon is basically that experience turned into a vegetable. Tansy tells an even stranger story, and honestly it might be my favourite one in this entire chapter. Picture a feathery fern-like plant growing wild along hedgerows and roadsides, topped with small clusters of round, button-like yellow flowers that never quite open the way you would expect a flower to. Crush a leaf between your fingers and the smell hits you immediately. Sharp, herbal, almost medicinal, more like camphor or strong cough drops than anything you would normally associate with dinner. The plant's own name may even trace back to a Greek word connected to immortality, tied to old folk beliefs that it could help preserve a body, a small strange thread of superstition running quietly underneath its very ordinary appearance along an English hedgerow, and yet across medieval England especially, tansy found its way directly into something sweet. Small cakes and puddings traditionally prepared and eaten around the Easter season. The timing was not accidental. After weeks of fasting through Lent, families believed their bodies needed a kind of internal reset, and bitter herbs like tansy carried a long-standing reputation for helping with exactly that. A rich sweet cake studded with a truly bitter medicinal-tasting herb sounds almost contradictory to modern ears. Sweetness and bitterness rarely invited to the same plate today. But to medieval households that contrast was not a flaw in the recipe. It was the entire point. Families across entire villages would have prepared some version of this same cake around roughly the same week each spring, an unspoken shared ritual stretching across an untold number of separate kitchens, all reaching for the exact same bitter little plant at precisely the same moment on the calendar. There is something quietly moving in that image, dozens of households scattered across a single valley, none of them coordinating with one another directly, all somehow arriving at the very same small act of springtime renewal, simply because they had all inherited the same quiet instinct passed down from their own mothers and grandmothers before them. Why though? Why would anyone deliberately want their food to taste sharp, medicinal, borderline unpleasant, especially on a day meant for celebration? The answer connects directly back to that whole medical framework we spent time exploring earlier in this journey, the belief that every food carried its own set of internal qualities capable of nudging the human body back toward balance. Bitter, sharp-tasting plants were generally understood as drying and cleansing useful, precisely because they were assumed to help clear out whatever heaviness had built up in the body over a long restricted season of simple fasting food. Eating something bitter was not just tolerated on Easter morning. It was viewed as almost medically appropriate, a deliberate, purposeful jolt meant to wake the body back up after weeks of quiet restraint. I find something almost poetic in that logic, honestly, even setting aside whether the underlying science actually holds up. Spring itself arrives sharp and sudden after a long, grey winter, and there is something fitting about greeting it with a flavour that hits you the exact same way. A small deliberate shock to the system timed precisely to match the season outside your window. There's a quieter plant worth mentioning here too, one that rarely got a starring role of its own, but shaped an enormous number of medieval dishes from somewhere in the background. Lovage carries an intense concentrated celery flavour, far sharper and more assertive than the pale, watery stalks sold in grocery stores today. A single handful of chopped lovage leaves could season an entire pot of pottage, doing the work that a dozen sad little celery ribs might struggle to manage. Cooks leaned on it constantly in soups, in stews, in sauces, treating it almost the way a modern kitchen treats bouillon cubes, or stock concentrate, a small powerful shortcut to real depth of flavour. It grew tall and sturdy in almost any kitchen garden, worth the name, requiring so little attention that a single well-established plant could quite reasonably keep an entire household supplied with seasoning for years without any real effort beyond the occasional harvest. Some gardeners let it grow to shoulder height and beyond a tall leafy sentinel standing guard near the kitchen door, more reliable than almost anything else planted nearby. If your household kept a patch of lovage growing somewhere near the kitchen door, you effectively owned a renewable, endlessly reusable flavour supply, available any time the pot needed a little more character. Even its hollow, sturdy stalks found a use of their own, sometimes hollowed out further and used almost like a straw, a small playful detail that has nothing at all to do with cooking and everything to do with how thoroughly a truly useful plant tends to work its way into every corner of daily life. Can you imagine walking out your own back door right now and picking a handful of fresh herb, strong enough to completely transform an entire pot of soup, no bouillon cube, no stock concentrate from a plastic tub required? I sometimes wonder how much of our modern reliance on manufactured flavour exists, simply because most of us stopped growing anything intense enough to do the job ourselves. There is a myth worth addressing directly here because it comes up constantly whenever people picture medieval cooking. A lot of us assume food from this period must have tasted bland dull, weighed down by nothing more exciting than boiled root vegetables and thin gruel. Cardoon tansy and lovage tell a completely different story. If anything, medieval and Renaissance kitchens lean toward flavours considerably more aggressive than most of what fills a modern plate, bitter, sharp, intensely herbal, built for palates that had not yet been trained generation after generation to expect gentleness in every single bite. This was not unseasoned, timid cooking. It was bold cooking, confident enough to hand a guest something that might actually bite back. And that raises a truly interesting question, one worth sitting with for a moment before we move along. When exactly did our collective taste shift so dramatically toward mild, sweet and gentle, and away from bitter, sharp and bold? Part of the answer traces back to something we touched on earlier in this journey. This slow spread of affordable refined sugar across Europe, which gradually retrained expectations at nearly every level of society. Once sweetness became cheap and widely available, bitterness increasingly registered as a flaw to be masked rather than a quality worth savouring on its own terms. Modern food production pushed the trend even further, standardizing flavors across enormous markets, smoothing out the sharp edges that might have once made a single household's pottage taste distinct from the pot simmering next door. What started as a shift in which ingredients people could afford slowly hardened into an entire culture's definition of what food was even supposed to taste like in the first place. None of this means older palates were somehow more sophisticated than ours, or that ours are somehow lesser for preferring gentler things. Taste is not a contest with a correct answer, but it is worth remembering that what feels like an obvious natural preference, craving sweetness, avoiding bitterness, is itself a kind of quiet historical inheritance shaped by trade routes and sugar prices and industrial habits stretching back centuries rather than some fixed universal truth about the human tongue. Coffee drinkers and dark chocolate lovers today are in a small way keeping a tiny ember of that older, bolder tradition alive. Whether they realize it or not, proof that a taste for genuine bitterness never fully disappeared. It simply retreated into a much smaller corner of the modern menu. What is the most intense, unusual flavor you truly enjoy? The kind of thing a lot of people around you might wrinkle their nose at: black licorice, strong blue cheese, a curry hot enough to make your eyes water. I would love to hear about it, honestly, because I suspect a few of you are quietly carrying around your own small personal version of Cardoon. So far tonight, we've tasted our way through bitterness chosen deliberately on purpose by households wealthy enough to have real choice in the matter. Cardoon demanded weeks of careful blanching. Tansy required a garden, or at least a hedgerow within easy reach, and the leisure to bake something elaborate purely for a seasonal ritual. Lovage needed nothing more than a little patience and a small corner of soil, but even that modest investment was still in its own way a choice available only to a household with some measure of stability behind it. But choice, as we have already seen more than once on this journey, was never something every household actually had. There was one vegetable, humble, plain, endlessly boiled, that showed up on nearly every single table across medieval Europe, regardless of income, regardless of class, regardless of taste at all. Rich or poor, everyone ate it. And the story of exactly why reveals something important about how deeply food and social position were tangled together during this entire period. The vegetable in question is one you almost certainly have sitting in your own refrigerator right now, or at the very least you've eaten some version of it within the last week without giving it a second thought. Cabbage, or as most medieval households across England and much of Europe simply called it, colewort. It showed up in the wealthiest manor kitchens and the poorest cottage gardens alike in soups, in pies, boiled plain, stuffed, pickled for the winter months, so completely ordinary that almost nobody at the time thought it worth writing a single admiring word about. Compare that to nearly everything else we have covered so far in this journey. Roots demanded as royal tribute, roots believed to cure snakebite roots so bitter they needed weeks of patient darkness just to become edible. Cabbage asked for none of that drama. It simply grew reliably everywhere and quietly became the one plant almost nobody in medieval Europe could imagine an entire year of meals without. Earlier in this journey, we glanced at a royal decree listing cabbage among dozens of other plants. A king expected his estates to grow, and we mentioned in passing that medieval cabbage looked nothing like the tight, dense head sitting on a supermarket shelf. Today, more like loose, open leaves than anything resembling a proper ball. I want to build on that small detail tonight because it turns out to be the opening thread of a story considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than a simple vegetable deserves. Here is something I think will truly surprise you, the kind of fact I love dropping into a quiet conversation just to watch someone's face change. Cabbage, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi are not 6 different vegetables at all. Botanically speaking, they are the exact same plant species, Brassica oleracea, every single one of them descended from the same wild sea cliff, growing ancestor somewhere along the coasts of southern and western Europe. That wild ancestor still exists today, a scraggly, tough little plant clinging to salty coastal rock faces, looking almost nothing like any of its now famous descendants, more like a tenacious weed than anything you would ever willingly put in a shopping basket. What looks to us like an entire produce aisle full of distinct choices is underneath all of it one single stubborn plant quietly reshaped over many centuries by farmers selecting for whichever part of it happened to please them most. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere generations of patient growers noticed a plant with slightly larger leaves and saved its seeds instead of another plant's over and over year after year, slowly coaxing those leaves into tighter and tighter formation, until eventually an entire dense head of cabbage emerged where loose open leaves once grew. A different set of growers working with the exact same base plant noticed instead when a stem happened to swell into something round and crisp, and kept selecting for that instead, eventually arriving at kohlrabi. Somebody else noticed flower buds clustering unusually thick and tight, and patiently nudged that trait forward across enough generations to eventually produce broccoli and later cauliflower. One single wild plant quietly branching into an entire family tree of vegetables, purely through centuries of human attention and preference. Picture a small plot somewhere on a hillside, generations the same family working the exact same patch of soil each year, walking the rows before harvest eyes, scanning for the one plant that looked just slightly different from its neighbours, a leaf a touch fuller, a stem a touch rounder. That single plant and no other provided the seeds for next year's planting. Repeat that same quiet decision every single season for 200 years, 400 years, and you eventually arrive somewhere entirely new without anyone ever making one single dramatic choice. Nobody woke up one morning and invented broccoli. Somebody simply preferred one plant slightly more than the others and kept preferring it generation after patient generation. Medieval colewort sat much nearer to the plain leafy ancestral end of that whole family tree than to the specialized branches we take for granted today. The tighter cabbage heads familiar to modern shoppers, and especially the more elaborate specialty forms like cauliflower and broccoli, developed considerably later, largely through careful cultivation in Italian gardens during the centuries following the medieval period before gradually spreading outward across the rest of Europe. When someone in this story we've been building together reached for cabbage, they were almost always reaching for something more like a loose bunch of hardy dark green leaves than the pale, compact vegetable most of us picture today. And here is a small linguistic gift this humble plant left us, one hiding in plain sight, in a dish most of you have probably eaten at a summer barbecue without ever thinking twice about its name: coleslaw. That first half cole comes directly from the exact same old word as colewort, borrowed originally from Latin and quietly surviving intact inside a completely ordinary modern dish, a shredded cabbage salad most people assume is a purely modern invention. Order a scoop of coleslaw at a restaurant this week, and you're in a small but very real sense still speaking a fragment of medieval vocabulary out loud without realizing it. The same root word tucked itself into other modern names too, collard greens among them. A whole scattered family of everyday words quietly descended from that same old term for a plain leafy garden vegetable. Nobody thought twice about 800 years ago. Have you ever caught yourself using a word or phrase for years before suddenly learning where it actually came from? I love those moments. Honestly, the small jolt of realizing an ordinary piece of your own daily life has been quietly carrying history around inside it the whole time, waiting patiently for somebody to finally notice. Now, precisely because cabbage in its various leafy, loose-headed forms grew so easily, so reliably in almost any soil across almost any region, it became one of the truest universal vegetables of the entire medieval period, showing up on tables belonging to peasants and nobles alike. But universal did not mean identical. The exact same base ingredient could tell two completely different stories depending entirely on whose kitchen it passed through. In a modest household, cabbage typically meant exactly what you would expect, boiled, simply seasoned with little more than salt tossed into the pottage pot, alongside whatever else happened to be available that week. Reliable, filling, unremarkable, the kind of vegetable nobody wrote poetry about because nobody needed to. It simply worked week after week without complaint or fanfare. In a wealthier household, though, that very same cabbage might arrive at the table dressed in an entirely different identity altogether. Cooks working for households with real money to spend folded it into dishes built around expensive imported spices, ground almonds, sometimes a splash of good wine, sometimes simmered gently alongside meat drippings, rich enough to soak into every leaf, transforming a plain everyday vegetable into something considerably more like a genuine delicacy. A guest seated at a wealthy table might never guess tasting it, that the base ingredient sitting on their plate was the exact same plant simmering that same evening in a plain iron pot 3 miles down the road. The vegetable itself never changed. What changed was everything surrounding it. The spices layered on top, the labour invested in its preparation, the audience it was ultimately meant to impress. A cook working in a great household might spend the better part of an afternoon on a single cabbage dish roasting the almonds, grinding them fine, balancing the exact right measure of costly spice against the vegetable's own natural sharpness, while not far away another cook simply dropped a whole head straight into a boiling pot and moved on to the next task entirely. Isn't that a strange kind of power for a single plant to hold, being simultaneously the most humble food on the table, and with just a little money and effort applied something considerably more refined? I do not think many modern vegetables carry quite that same range. This same period also saw something else quietly taking shape, a shift in how wealthier households thought about their gardens altogether. Earlier in this journey we spent time inside a peasant's small toft, a modest patch of ground behind a simple home doing its best to keep one family fed through an uncertain year. Compare that now to what a truly wealthy household, a manor or monastery later, a grand Renaissance estate increasingly began building. Instead, a proper kitchen garden, carefully planned, neatly divided into separate beds, growing not just one type of cabbage, but several distinct varieties side by side alongside herbs, fruit trees, and increasingly plants chosen as much for visual arrangement as for practical use. Walk through one of these grander gardens and you might pass an entire dedicated bed of leafy kale, beside another devoted to something much like an early cauliflower, the family resemblance between them almost invisible to anyone who had not just heard the story I told you a few minutes ago. A garden like that was doing considerably more than simply feeding a household. It was quietly announcing something about the people who owned it, growing 5 different varieties from that same humble brassica family, some for leaves, some for stems, some for early experimental flower heads, imported from abroad, required land labour, and a level of horticultural curiosity that a struggling cottager simply had no room for, literally or otherwise. Diversity itself in a garden slowly became its own quiet form of wealth, every bit as telling as the cut of somebody's clothing or the number of horses standing in their stable. A visitor walking through such a garden did not need to be told the family was prosperous. The sheer variety of leaves and shapes on display told them everything they needed to know before a single word was exchanged. There is something worth noticing in how quietly this particular status symbol operated too, compared to the grander, louder ones we have already encountered on this journey. A jewelled crown announces wealth from across an entire room. A carefully arranged row of 5 different cabbage relatives announces the exact same thing, just as clearly to anyone who actually understood what they were looking at, only far more subtly hidden in plain sight behind a garden wall, rather than displayed on a throne. I find that shift truly fascinating, to sit with the same base vegetable, transforming over centuries from a simple universal food into something that could also, depending entirely on how many varieties of it you happen to own, function as a kind of edible status symbol. So here is a question worth turning over in your own mind for a moment. If cabbage, kale, broccoli and cauliflower are all secretly the same plant wearing different disguises, purely because of what humans decided to breed for, what does that tell us about how thin the line really is between a wild plant and a completely tamed one? None of these vegetables required some external dramatic transformation to become what they are today. They required nothing more than patient attention, repeated across an almost unimaginable number of quiet growing seasons, one grower after another simply choosing to save the seeds that looked slightly more promising than the rest. There is a small myth worth clearing up here too, since it tends to surface whenever this particular fact comes up in conversation. People sometimes assume such dramatic transformation must be a distinctly modern trick, something only possible with laboratories and modern genetic science. It is not. Every single one of these vegetables existed in something near its current recognizable form well before modern science had any real understanding of genetics whatsoever. Ordinary farmers accomplished all of it patiently, methodically, purely by watching which plants pleased them, and which did not, then making the same small choice again the following spring, and the spring after that for longer than any single human lifetime could ever hope to witness from start to finish. That is worth sitting with for a moment, honestly. An entire branching family of vegetables shaped slowly across centuries by countless anonymous hands. Nobody remembers today, each one contributing nothing more than a single small decision about which seeds to save. No one person invented broccoli. No one person invented cauliflower. Thousands of ordinary growers did together one quiet season at a time, without ever fully realizing the scale of what they were collectively building. What is something in your own life, I wonder, that improves slowly, almost invisibly, through nothing more dramatic than small repeated choices made consistently over a very long stretch of time? We have spent this entire journey together watching plants rise, fall, transform and occasionally disappear, shaped by kings, by monks, by hungry families, by careful cooks chasing an unusual flavor. But everything we have covered so far unfolded at the same steady, patient pace, seasons passing one after another across an already familiar landscape, centuries of quiet selection, producing change so gradual that nobody alive at any single moment could have actually watched it happen. A farmer choosing one slightly rounder cabbage over another had no idea he was participating in a project that would not finish for another 200 years. That pace was about to change dramatically and almost overnight by historical standards. Somewhere across an ocean, nobody in this story had ever crossed an entirely different set of plants, was waiting plants that would arrive not through centuries of careful breeding but through a handful of ships, and would reshape European gardens more completely and more quickly than any king's decree or monk's careful cultivation ever managed to accomplish. In the year 1492, a handful of ships crossed an ocean most people in Europe had never seriously imagined crossing at all, and when those ships eventually turned back toward home, they carried something far more consequential than gold or spices. Tucked among the cargo, almost as an afterthought compared to everything else, everyone was excited about at the time sat seeds and roots, belonging to an entire world of plants nobody in Europe had ever laid eyes on before. Nobody standing on the dock that day watching crates unloaded onto unfamiliar soil could have guessed they were witnessing the opening scene of the single biggest transformation European gardens would ever experience. Historians now call this whole sprawling exchange the Columbian Exchange, and it deserves every bit of that grand-sounding name. Tomatoes at the time considered ornamental at best, dangerous at worst. Peppers capable of adding real heat to a cuisine that had until then relied almost entirely on imported black pepper for anything resembling spice. Maize, which would eventually transform farming as far away as northern China. Squash. Beans of an entirely new kind, different enough from the peas and broad beans already familiar in every European garden that early botanists struggled to even classify them properly. And quietly, almost without anyone at the time grasping how completely it would eventually reshape an entire continent's dinner table, the potato. We have spent a great deal of time together on this journey, following patient centuries-long stories, roots slowly bred over generations, gardens shaped gradually by careful royal decree, flavors passed down quietly from mother to daughter, across countless unremarkable Tuesdays. What happened next did not follow that same patient rhythm at all. It happened fast, in historical terms almost violently fast, and by the time the dust settled, an enormous portion of the vegetable world we've been exploring together tonight had been quietly, permanently pushed toward the margins. Let's start with the potato itself, because its real story begins long before any European ship ever set sail. High in the Andes Mountains, communities had already been cultivating potatoes for thousands of years before Columbus was even born, developing an almost unbelievable range of varieties suited to wildly different altitude, soils and growing conditions. Some varieties thrived at elevations so high and so cold that almost nothing else edible could survive there at all, carefully selected across countless generations for exactly that kind of stubborn resilience. Researchers studying this agricultural tradition have identified well over 100 distinct cultivated varieties passed down through generations of careful, deliberate selection. An achievement every bit as impressive in its own right as anything we admired a little earlier in this journey about the slow reshaping of a single, humble cabbage plant. Long before any European had ever tasted one, Andean farmers had already turned the potato into a masterpiece of patient, practical engineering, developed independently on the opposite side of the entire planet, without a single shred of contact with anything happening in a European garden. They even developed clever methods for preserving the harvest through freeze-drying at high altitude, alternating bitter cold nights with intense daytime sun to draw moisture out of the tubers, completely producing a lightweight, long-lasting food that could be stored for years, an achievement that would not have looked out of place among the careful preservation techniques we admired earlier in a very different garden on a very different continent. When Spanish explorers eventually encountered the crop and carried samples back across the ocean, sometime around the middle of the 1500s, Europe did not exactly welcome it with open arms. Quite the opposite, honestly. The potato belongs to the same broad plant family as several truly dangerous well-known poisons, deadly nightshade among them, alongside other suspicious relatives like mandrake and henbane, plants already firmly associated in the European imagination with witchcraft and slow poisoning. European botanists working from that uncomfortable family resemblance grew immediately and deeply suspicious. Word spread that the potato might be toxic, that it might cause disease, that eating something grown underground, oddly shaped and vaguely resembling a diseased limb could not possibly be good for a person. In France specifically, the suspicion grew serious enough that the government formally banned potato cultivation altogether in the year 1748, worried the crop might actually cause leprosy. Think about that for a moment. An entire country outlawed a vegetable by law based on nothing more than an unfortunate resemblance and a healthy dose of collective fear. Can you imagine a food, this ordinary something, now sitting quietly in almost every kitchen you have ever stepped into, once being treated as dangerous enough to ban outright farmers? In some regions, reportedly refused to even touch the plant with bare hands, convinced the leaves alone might carry some of that same suspicious poison, lurking in its more infamous relatives. I think it says something rather comforting about human progress, honestly, how thoroughly we eventually got past that particular fear. Getting past it took one especially determined man, and I think his story deserves real attention here, because it is honestly one of my favourite true stories in the entire history of food. His name was Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, a French army pharmacist who during a war against Prussia ended up captured and held as a prisoner for several years. His captors fed him potatoes day after day, meal after meal, the only food reliably available. Parmentier survived those years in reasonably good health and left his imprisonment utterly convinced the vegetable, his own countrymen dismissed as dangerous, even fit only for pigs, was actually perfectly safe, truly nourishing food. Convincing an entire nation of that, though, turned out to be considerably harder than surviving a Prussian prison camp. Parmentier spent years campaigning publishing papers, eventually helping overturn France's official potato ban in the early 1770s. But changing a law is not the same as changing people's minds, and the French public remained stubbornly unconvinced. So Parmentier, in a stroke of genuine marketing brilliance centuries before anyone used that phrase, tried something considerably more creative than another dry pamphlet. He hosted elaborate dinners built entirely around potato dishes, inviting prominent guests, including on at least one documented occasion Benjamin Franklin himself. He presented delicate bouquets of potato flowers to King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, who reportedly wore the blossoms in public tucked into a lapel pinned into elegantly styled hair. None of it fully worked. The public, it turned out, could admire a flower worn by a queen without feeling any real urge to eat the root attached to it. There is something almost sweetly stubborn about that. An entire population perfectly willing to decorate itself with potato blossoms while still refusing quite firmly to put the actual vegetable anywhere near their mouths. So Parmentier tried one final wonderfully devious trick. Granted a plot of land just outside Paris, he planted it entirely with potatoes and surrounded the whole field with armed guards patrolling visibly day after day, as though protecting something enormously valuable. Word spread quickly through the surrounding area. Whatever was growing behind those guards, people assumed had to be worth having. Then every single night, Parmentier quietly instructed his guards to withdraw, leaving the field completely unwatched until morning, with strict instructions to look the other way or accept a quiet bribe if anyone happened to come sneaking through in the dark. People stole the potatoes almost immediately, of course, sneaking in under cover of darkness, exactly as Parmentier had hoped from the very beginning. And once those stolen potatoes made their way into ordinary gardens across the countryside, curiosity finally did what years of pamphlets and royal endorsements had failed to accomplish. People discovered quietly on their own terms that the mysterious guarded vegetable was actually rather good. I love that story precisely because it is not really about agriculture at all. It is about human psychology, about how forbidden things become desirable things, almost automatically, a trick that apparently worked exactly as well in 1780s France as it does in a modern advertising campaign built around the phrase limited edition. A remarkably similar story gets told about Prussia too, this time involving a king rather than a pharmacist, supposedly running the exact same guarded field trick decades earlier on his own reluctant farmers. Whether both versions happened exactly as legend describes them or not, the fact that the same clever trick shows up twice, in two different countries, tells you something rather telling about how predictably human curiosity behaves once you tell it no. Real undeniable proof arrived not long after in the form of genuine crisis. A serious famine struck parts of northern France in the year 1785, and in the desperate scramble to keep entire villages fed potatoes, proved themselves in the only way that ultimately mattered. They simply worked reliably when almost nothing else could be counted on. Whole communities that had spent decades politely declining Parmentius' dinner parties suddenly found themselves planting his despised vegetable out of pure, unavoidable necessity, and discovered to their own quiet surprise that it kept them alive through a winter that grain alone could not have carried them through. And here is the deeper mathematical reason potatoes eventually swept so completely across an entire continent's fields beyond any clever marketing trick. A single acre planted with potatoes could reliably feed roughly 3 times as many people as that same acre planted with wheat. Potatoes also tolerated poorer, wetter soil than most traditional European grain crops ever could, thriving in regions where wheat had always struggled, and produced a harvest underground safely tucked away from hailstorms and grazing animals that might otherwise wipe out an entire field of exposed grain in a single bad afternoon. No amount of careful royal planning, the kind we admired earlier in this journey, could match numbers quite that dramatic. Once that basic arithmetic became impossible to ignore, no amount of lingering superstition could hold the crop back for long. Do you remember earlier in this journey a certain sweet root that once commanded an emperor's personal attention, eventually pushed aside by exactly this same overwhelming mathematics? That earlier story only gestured briefly at the reason behind its decline. Now you have the fuller picture. It was not simply that potatoes tasted better or grew more easily in isolation. It was that an entire continent, once it finally got past its own fear, discovered a crop capable of feeding families more reliably, more abundantly on less land than nearly anything already growing in a European garden. Once that discovery took hold, dozens of older, gentler, more labour-intensive vegetables never stood a fair chance. Population figure across Europe climbed noticeably in the centuries following the potato's slow, reluctant acceptance. Historians tracing a meaningful portion of that growth directly back to the sheer caloric efficiency this one root finally provided once fear gave way to hunger and plain necessity. Entire regions once considered too poor in soil, too wet, too cold for reliable grain, farming suddenly found themselves capable of supporting families in numbers that would have seemed impossible only a generation or two earlier. A crop once banned by royal decree, once dismissed as pig feed, once feared as a source of disease, ended up quietly responsible for feeding a meaningful share of an entire continent's population growth. Very few vegetables in this story we've told together tonight can claim an impact quite that enormous. What do you think it actually takes for a whole society to change its mind about something it once considered dangerous? A law, a famine. A clever guard posted around a field of stolen vegetables. I suspect, honestly, it usually takes some uncomfortable combination of all three. And what is something you personally resisted for years out of pure suspicion before finally trying it and wondering what on earth took you so long? There is a certain quiet irony worth sitting with as we wrap up this particular chapter of the story. Everything we have explored together tonight so far, patient roots demanded as royal tribute, careful gardens shaped by law, flavors bred with astonishing patience across centuries existed within a world that had for generation after generation simply assumed the vegetable landscape it knew was more or less permanent. Then, within the span of only a few determined lifetimes, an entirely new cast of characters arrived from across an ocean and quietly rearranged the entire stage. The old vegetables were not defeated in open competition, not exactly. They were simply crowded out gradually by newcomers so nutritionally and agriculturally overwhelming that resistance, once the initial fear faded, barely lasted a single generation. Centuries of patient breeding, the kind we admired a little earlier tonight, suddenly looked almost quaint next to a route that had already been perfected, unknowingly on the far side of an entire ocean. A gardener tending 5 careful generations of cabbage relatives could spend an entire lifetime on the project. A ship needed only a single successful crossing, but this was hardly the first time an outside force violently rewrote what Europe grew and ate. Long before any ship ever returned from a new world nobody yet knew existed, an entirely different kind of catastrophe had already ripped through the same gardens we have been wandering through together tonight, leaving behind lessons about survival scarcity and desperate improvisation that still echo through every single story we have told so far. Spring of the year 1315 arrived across northern Europe, soaked grey and utterly relentless. Rain fell for weeks without any real break, turning carefully ploughed fields into standing water, rotting seed grain before it ever had the chance to properly take root. Farmers who had walked these same fields their entire lives, who understood exactly what a normal spring should feel like, underfoot watched something go quietly, catastrophically wrong. The rain simply would not stop week after week, turning what should have been a season of steady, hopeful growth into a slow, waterlogged disaster nobody had any real way of preventing. This was the beginning of what historians now simply call the Great Famine, and it arrived nearly 2 full centuries before a single ship ever returned from the New World, carrying the crops we spent time with a little earlier tonight. There was no potato waiting in reserve back then, no clever new arrival capable of saving the harvest. There was only the same familiar grain, the same familiar gardens failing everyone at almost exactly the same terrible moment. Chroniclers writing at the time describe roads turned to mud so thick that carts carrying what little grain remained sometimes could not even reach the markets that desperately needed it. Entire regions cut off from whatever meagre surplus their neighbours might otherwise have shared. To understand how serious this actually was, it helps to know a little about how medieval farming ordinarily worked. In a decent year, a farmer might expect to harvest somewhere around 7 grains of wheat. For every single grain planted back in the spring, a reasonable, sustainable return that could feed a family, pay whatever was owed to the local lord, and still leave enough seed behind to plant again next season. During the worst years of this particular famine, that ratio collapsed to something nearer to 2 grains harvested for every one planted. Do the arithmetic on that for a moment. After setting aside seed for the following year, an already desperate family might be left with almost nothing at all to actually eat. Modern industrial farming manages ratios nearer to 30-1 today, which makes the gap between a good medieval year and a catastrophic one feel even more precarious by comparison, a margin so thin that a single bad season could tip an entire region from comfortable into genuine crisis almost overnight. Salt grew scarce too oddly enough because the same relentless rain made it nearly impossible to properly evaporate seawater into usable salt, and without salt meat could not be reliably preserved through the coming winter. In some regions, the price of salt alone climbed by nearly 1/3 within a single season. Bread prices in parts of eastern France reportedly rose by well over 300%, pushing the most basic food available completely out of reach for families who only a year earlier had considered a loaf of bread the one reliable constant in an otherwise uncertain life. Livestock suffered too, since the same soaked fields that ruined the grain harvest also made it nearly impossible to properly dry hay for the winter months, leaving farmers with the impossible choice of watching their animals starve or slaughtering them early before they had put on anything near their normal weight. Can you imagine watching the price of bread triple within a single year, while your own family's harvest simultaneously collapsed to a fraction of what it should have been? I find it almost impossible to sit with that combination for very long without feeling a real ache on behalf of people who endured it. Real families, real children facing a winter with almost nothing reliable standing between them and true desperation. This is precisely the moment where a particular plant we spent time with earlier in this journey finally earned its keep in the most literal sense imaginable. Remember good King Henry, that stubborn, uncultivated green growing wild along roadsides and waste ground, requiring no careful garden, no cooperative weather, nothing but a patch of disturbed soil nobody else wanted. During years exactly like these, that plant and others, equally willing to grow without permission or encouragement, quietly became the difference between an empty table and a survivable one. Picture a mother walking the same familiar path she once only bothered with in the leanest weeks of an ordinary winter, only now walking it every single day, checking every hedgerow, every neglected corner of the waste ground, gathering whatever green stubborn thing had managed to survive the ruined season around it. Families who might never have bothered gathering it in a normal year suddenly found themselves searching every hedgerow and abandoned patch of ground within walking distance, grateful for a plant that asked absolutely nothing of them in return for what it offered. Chronicles from this period describe people eating things that in an ordinary year nobody would have considered food at all, tree bark ground into something resembling flour, wild grasses roots dug up from forest floors that had never once been intentionally cultivated. This was not resourcefulness born of curiosity. It was survival plain and desperate, and it reveals something important about the entire story we've been building together tonight. Every single forgotten vegetable we have discussed, every wild green dismissed today as an ordinary weed, once represented the difference between a family making it through a catastrophic season or not making it through at all. Even monasteries, the very same communities we spent time with earlier in this journey, carefully tending their physic gardens and preserving old Roman knowledge, found their own reserves strained past anything they had ever prepared for, opening their stores to desperate neighbours far beyond what any garden manual could have anticipated. And here is something worth sitting with, honestly, because it says a great deal about how thoroughly this crisis exposed the fault lines already running through medieval society. Grain reserves large enough to weather a genuine emergency existed almost exclusively among royalty, powerful lords, wealthy merchants and the church, the very same households capable of affording the elaborate spiced cabbage dishes and prized skillet pies we spent time with earlier in this journey. Ordinary families, the same households we spent time with earlier tonight tending their small toft, keeping their modest pots simmering week after week, had no such cushion at all. When the harvest failed, they simply had nowhere else to turn. Some desperate parents, according to surviving records from the period, reportedly abandoned children. They could no longer feed a detail so painful it is honestly difficult to sit with, and one that tells you more clearly than any statistic could exactly how far ordinary families were pushed before this crisis finally eased. The very same social structure that shaped every single meal we have discussed so far in this story also determined with brutal clarity exactly who would survive a famine and who would not. The Great Famine eventually eased after roughly 2 difficult years, though full recovery took considerably longer. But Europe had barely finished rebuilding when an entirely different catastrophe arrived. One that made a poor harvest look almost gentle by comparison, striking a population already weakened, already stretched thin from the years of scarcity that came before it. Nutritionists studying this period have suggested that the widespread malnutrition left behind by the famine may have made entire communities considerably more vulnerable to whatever arrived next. Bodies already worn thin, immune systems already taxed by years of an inadequate, unpredictable diet. Beginning in the year 1346, a devastating outbreak of plague swept across Europe, claiming a staggering portion of the entire population within just a few short years. I am not going to dwell on the details of that suffering tonight, partly because entire documentaries exist dedicated to exactly that, and partly because I think the more interesting story for our purposes lies in what happened to European gardens and farms once the worst of it had finally passed. With so much of the workforce gone, an unexpected and rather strange shift took place. Surviving peasants suddenly found their own labour considerably more valuable than it had ever been before. Fewer hands remained to work the same amount of land, and lords, who had once commanded labour almost without question, now found themselves negotiating sometimes desperately to keep any workers at all. Wages rose. Some of the rigid feudal obligations we discussed earlier in this journey, the unpaid days a family owed working a lord's own fields before ever tending their own, began quietly loosening across large parts of Europe, simply because there were no longer enough people left to enforce the old arrangement as strictly as before. It feels almost uncomfortable to say out loud, and I want to be careful and honest with you about this. But historians generally agree that in the decades following this unimaginable tragedy, many surviving peasant families experienced measurably improved conditions, better wages, more available land, occasionally even a small garden expanded beyond what their parents had ever been permitted to keep. Some historians even point to this exact period as the beginning of the slow, uneven decline of the rigid feudal system. Altogether the same system that once dictated almost down to the hour how a peasant family divided their week between their lord's fields and their own. Catastrophe reshaped the entire structure of medieval society, and in one of history's more uncomfortable ironies, some of the very people who survived it eventually found themselves with a little more room to breathe than they had ever known before. I do not say that to suggest the plague was somehow a hidden blessing. It was an almost unimaginable tragedy by any honest measure. But history rarely offers us clean, simple lessons, and I think there is real value in sitting with the discomfort of that complexity, rather than smoothing it over into something tidier than it actually was. There is one more thread worth weaving into this particular chapter, something that connects quietly to nearly everything we have explored together tonight. Even during ordinary, uneventful years, medieval Christians observed a surprising number of fasting days scattered throughout the calendar. Lent's 40 days leading up to Easter, regular fasting on certain weekdays, additional restricted periods tied to other religious observances. On these days, meat was forbidden, and households leaned heavily on vegetables, legumes, and fish instead. Cooks grew remarkably inventive within those restrictions too, learning to press almonds into a rich dairy-free milk, even shaping coloured almond paste into small convincing imitations of hard-boiled eggs, for households determined to keep the table looking festive despite the restrictions of the season. Wealthier households turned fasting into its own peculiar art form, disguising fish as meat and meat-shaped foods as something else entirely, while poorer families simply leaned further into whatever the pot already contained, cabbage leeks, whatever green thing the season allowed. Add all of those scattered fasting days together across a single year, and you arrive at something truly remarkable. Roughly a third of the entire calendar in many communities built structurally around eating considerably less meat and considerably more of exactly the vegetables we've spent this whole journey exploring together. Have you ever stopped to consider how much of ordinary daily life gets quietly shaped by rules nobody actively questions anymore simply because everyone around you has always followed them. And do you think a household that practiced this kind of careful, vegetable-centered rationing every single year was better prepared, even a little, for the day a true crisis actually arrived? That quiet year-round rhythm of vegetable-heavy eating may have mattered more than anyone at the time realized. Communities already accustomed to leaning on their gardens for a third of the calendar, already skilled at stretching modest greens into something resembling a full meal, were in a strange way better prepared for genuine crisis than a purely meat-centered society might have been. The humble, unglamorous plants we have spent this entire journey celebrating were not simply background details in medieval life. They were quietly and consistently part of the very infrastructure that kept an entire civilization standing through its very worst years. We have now walked through royal indulgence, careful law, honest hunger, patient medicine, strange flavor, and finally outright catastrophe. Every single one of these vegetables we've met tonight survived all of that, survived kings and plagues and centuries of quiet neglect. Think about everything a plant like Good King Henry actually endured across the stretch of this story alone: indifference in comfortable years, sudden desperate reliance during famine, quiet dismissal once the crisis passed, and people once again had the luxury of preferring something else. And yet somehow most of them are gone from our tables today anyway. That is the question worth sitting with as we head into the final stretch of tonight's story. If these plants were resilient enough to survive literal famine, resilient enough to feed an entire continent through its very worst centuries, what on earth finally managed to make us forget them completely, quietly, gently, once the emergencies finally stopped coming? Here is the honest answer to that question, and it is not the answer you might expect. There was no single villain in this story. No king ever issued a decree banning skirt from every table in his kingdom. No church council ever declared cabbage acceptable and Good King Henry forbidden. Nothing that dramatic ever happened at all. Instead, if you look back across everything we have wandered through together tonight, you start to notice the same quiet pattern, showing up again and again, wearing a slightly different disguise each time. Sometimes a plant lost its place because something more efficient simply outcompeted it, the way a sweet, delicate root once beloved by an emperor eventually could not keep pace with a tuber capable of feeding 3 times as many people from the exact same patch of ground. Sometimes a plant did not lose a competition at all. It simply got renamed, quietly reclassified from a valued household green into an ordinary weed, the recipe never changing, only the word attached to it. Sometimes the entire reason a plant existed, patiently surviving underground through winter, so a family could taste something fresh in the coldest months, simply stopped mattering the moment a ship or a train could deliver that same freshness from somewhere warmer any month of the year. Sometimes an entire family of vegetables spent centuries patiently branching into new shapes and new names, only to be completely overshadowed within a few decades by newcomers arriving from across an ocean nobody had even known existed. And sometimes the people who once tended these plants, generation after generation monks in a coastal garden, women managing a modest household plot, were simply scattered. Their gardens left untended, their careful knowledge never fully passed along to whoever came next. Notice too how often the actual flavour of these plants had almost nothing to do with their disappearance. Skirt did not stop tasting sweet. Good King Henry did not stop being nutritious. Scorzonera never once lost its faint, briny resemblance to oysters. In story after story tonight, the vegetable itself stayed exactly as good as it had always been. What changed was everything happening around it: the economics, the labels, the convenience, the sheer dumb luck of history moving one direction instead of another. That distinction matters, I think. We tend to assume the things that fade from our lives must have grown less worthy somehow. Usually they simply grew less convenient, which is an entirely different and considerably less flattering kind of ending. None of that adds up to a single dramatic ending. It adds up to something quieter, and in its own way more human. These vegetables were not defeated so much as they were gently, gradually set aside, the way any of us might set aside an old hobby, an old friendship, an old favourite song, not out of any conscious decision to abandon it, but simply because life kept moving forward and something newer kept catching our attention instead. A crown falls because somebody takes it by force. A vegetable simply stops being planted one spring, and nobody notices until several springs later that it never came back at all. Think for a moment about everyone and everything we've met together across this entire story. A young nun whose name history never bothered to record kneeling in cold soil beside the sea, tending a plant that would go on to outlive an entire religious order. An emperor feared and mistrusted by nearly everyone around him, who nonetheless surrendered completely to the simple pleasure of one sweet humble root, so completely that an entire province was expected to send it to him every single year. A king who tried to turn the private comfort of a well-kept garden into public law across an entire continent, ordering house leeks onto rooftops and pear trees into orchards, with the same seriousness he brought to matters of war. A mother unnamed, uncelebrated, quietly keeping her family alive through countless ordinary winters with nothing more than a single pot and a patch of soil barely larger than a doorway. A visionary abbess who saw no real difference between feeding a body and healing one, and who left behind music still performed centuries after her death. A dark twisted root wrongly believed to cure the very danger it resembled, that nonetheless earned its place at the table through nothing more than an honest oceanic flavour. Cooks patient enough to spend weeks wrapping a single bitter stalk in straw and darkness simply because they trusted the reward waiting on the other side of that patience. A single wild cabbage quietly reshaped over centuries into an entire family tree of vegetables, sitting in your refrigerator right now without you ever noticing the resemblance. A pharmacist clever enough to make an entire nation crave a vegetable simply by pretending it was forbidden. Families who ground bark into flour and walked every hedgerow within reach simply to see another spring. And an entire civilization tested again and again by hunger, sickness, and outright catastrophe, quietly kept standing meal after ordinary meal by exactly the kind of humble plants most of us walk straight past today without a second glance. That is really what this whole journey has been about, if I'm honest with you. Not vegetables, not really. People. Ordinary, unrecorded, endlessly resourceful people, doing the quiet work of staying alive generation after generation, using nothing more dramatic than whatever happened to be growing nearby. Here is something rather lovely to end on, something that might truly surprise you. Almost none of what we talked about tonight is actually gone forever. Alexander still grows today wild and unbothered in the exact same coastal ruins where nuns once tended it centuries ago, completely unaware that anyone ever stopped caring for it. Good King Henry still turns up quietly in the corners of old cottage gardens across parts of Europe, waiting patiently for someone to recognize it as something other than a weed. Salsify and scorzonera still grow in specialty gardens, still taste faintly improbably of oysters for anyone curious enough to plant them. Skirret, believe it or not, still exists too, kept alive by a small but truly devoted community of gardeners who never quite let it slip away completely, trading roots and stories the same patient way it has always been passed along. Since the middle of the 1970s, an organization in the United States has worked quietly to collect and preserve exactly these kinds of old, half-forgotten seeds, distributing them to gardeners eager to grow something their own great-grandparents might have recognized instantly. Around the same general period, a movement that began in Italy built specifically around the idea of protecting traditional food and slowing down long enough to actually taste it properly spread outward across dozens of countries, quietly championing the exact same forgotten vegetables we've spent tonight getting to know. Chefs in small, thoughtful restaurants occasionally build entire seasonal menus around ingredients just like these, not out of nostalgia exactly, but because something raised with real patience, something history nearly let slip away, often turns out to taste considerably better than whatever replaced it. Somewhere right now in a backyard you will never see, someone is probably digging up a cluster of pale skirret roots, or peeling a sticky black scorzonera under running water, exactly the way we described earlier, quietly keeping this entire story alive without ever once thinking of themselves as part of history. None of these people are trying to reject anything modern either, which I think is worth saying clearly. Nobody growing skirret in their backyard today has sworn off potatoes forever, or stopped shopping at an ordinary grocery store the rest of the week. This is not a rejection of everything we gained along the way, the convenience, the year-round abundance, the sheer relief of never facing a season quite like the one we spent time inside a little earlier tonight. It is simply an insistence that convenience does not have to mean forgetting entirely. A garden can hold both the practical and the patient side by side, a bed of modern hybrid tomatoes growing not 10 feet from a small, stubborn patch of something almost nobody else remembers how to grow anymore. Progress and memory, it turns out, were never actually enemies. We only ever treated them that way because it was easier for a while to let one quietly crowd out the other. Isn't that a rather comforting thought to carry with you as tonight winds down? Nothing we explored together this evening is truly lost. It is only waiting quietly the same way it has always waited for someone curious enough to notice it again. I think that might be the real lesson tucked inside this entire story if you are willing to carry just one thing with you into sleep tonight. Being forgotten is never quite the same thing as disappearing completely. A name can fade, a garden can be abandoned, an entire way of eating can quietly slip out of fashion across a couple of generations. But the thing itself, the plant, the person, the small stubborn piece of history underneath it, all often simply waits patiently exactly where it has always been for somebody to finally look down and notice it again. Maybe that is true of more than vegetables, honestly. Maybe there is something in your own life right now that feels forgotten, set aside quietly out of fashion, waiting near the edge of your attention, the way good King Henry waits at the edge of an overgrown garden. An old friendship you let go, quiet, not out of any falling out, simply drift. A skill you were once proud of, tucked away somewhere and rarely used. A softer, slower version of yourself still there underneath everything life has piled on top since. None of it is necessarily gone. It might simply be waiting for you to walk past it one more time and this time actually stop to look. I think about the nun most of all, honestly, whenever I sit with that thought for very long. History never wrote down her name, and yet in a strange and roundabout way we spent an entire evening thinking about her anyway, about her cold hands, her patient rose, her small green plant that somehow outlasted a king. She could not have known any of that would happen. She was simply doing the next small task in front of her, morning after morning the way most of us do most days of our own lives, without any real sense of how far the consequences might eventually travel. Maybe that is worth remembering too the next time an ordinary day feels too small or too quiet to matter. You rarely get to see from the middle of your own life which small habit, which patient little garden might still be standing centuries after everything else around it has fallen away. Thank you truly for spending this entire evening here with me, wandering through gardens that mostly disappeared long before either of us was born. Stories like this only really work because somebody is willing to sit quietly and listen all the way to the end through emperors and famines and stubborn little roots, and tonight that somebody was you. Whether you joined me right at the very beginning or drifted off somewhere around that stubborn cardoon and only just resurfaced now, I am glad you spent even a little of your evening in this quiet corner of history with me. I hope some small piece of tonight's journey follows you gently into sleep, a nun kneeling in a cold garden, an emperor's favourite root, a pot that never quite emptied a whole forgotten world, patiently waiting somewhere just beneath the surface of the one we call home now. If you found your way here tonight and it brought you even a little comfort, I would love for you to stay a while longer in this quiet corner of the internet. A like helps more than you might guess, and if you feel like it, leave a little note about which part of tonight's story stayed with you the most: the nun and her stubborn garden, the emperor and his sweet root, or perhaps that small sticky-fingered ritual of peeling scotonera under cold running water. I look through every single one, and I love knowing which small corner of history found its way into someone else's night. Tell me too if you like where you're joining me from and what time it is where you are right now, tucked into bed, while I have been talking about nuns and emperors and stubborn little roots for the better part of the last few hours. There is always another story waiting just behind this one, another forgotten corner of history worth wandering into, together another quiet garden nobody has thought to visit in a very long time. I would be glad to have you back for it whenever you are ready to return. Sleep well tonight. Rest easy, and I will see you again soon for the next one.